Dean Corll grew up in Houston, Texas, in a seemingly ordinary family that ran a small candy business. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was quiet, polite, and almost forgettable. The kind of man who could disappear into the background of everyday life without raising suspicion. The candy factory his mother managed gave him his nickname, the Candy Man, and local children would sometimes receive free sweets from him, which only reinforced the image of a kindly figure. What no one could see behind the friendly exterior was a predatory darkness that slowly tightened its grip on the community. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Houston was a sprawling city where opportunity mixed with poverty, where many working-class families lived paycheck to paycheck and children often roamed the streets unsupervised. It was an environment that gave predators like Corll both the anonymity and the access they needed. He was not a flamboyant killer who craved the spotlight. Instead, he cultivated invisibility, a mask of normality that made it possible for him to commit some of the most horrifying crimes in American history. At first, Corll appeared to be just another bachelor living in his mother's orbit. He had a job, a house, and no particular vices that alarmed anyone. But quietly, he began forming relationships with teenage boys in the neighborhood. He would offer them rides, a place to hang out, or the lure of candy and small gifts. For young men who were bored, restless, or neglected, Corll's attention felt exciting. He gave them beer, marijuana, and a sense of belonging. Over time, he singled out two boys in particular, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., both of whom were impressionable and struggling with their own identities. Corll's manipulation of them was insidious. He did not simply befriend them. He groomed them, testing their boundaries, rewarding loyalty, and slowly introducing them to his darkest secrets. Brooks was the first to fall under his sway. He was still very young when Corll began inviting him to his home, offering him gifts and even a used car. By the time Brooks realized what Corll expected in return, the trap was already closing. He felt dependent, grateful, and unable to resist the older man's authority. Henley's path was slightly different. When he first met Corll, he was skeptical, but the money Corll offered to help lure other boys proved too tempting. These teenagers, too immature to grasp the enormity of what they were participating in, became accomplices to murder. The methods Corll used were chilling. He lured boys to his house under the promise of parties, drugs, or cash. Once there, the victims were overpowered, tied to a plywood torture board that became infamous in police files and subjected to unspeakable abuse before being strangled or shot. The banality of the setting was part of the horror. An ordinary suburban house where the curtains were drawn. Neighbors went about their lives, and inside the Candyman was dismantling the innocence of a generation. For years, boys went missing in Houston's poorer neighborhoods. Families reported disappearances, but police often dismissed them as runaways. This indifference allowed Corll's killing spree to stretch on. Parents knew something was wrong, yet without bodies, without evidence, and with the prevailing assumption that restless teens simply fled home life, the community's cries were muted. Corll exploited that void perfectly. Jack Olsen, in his book The Man with the Candy, captures this atmosphere with journalistic precision. He portrays Houston not as a glamorous metropolis, but as a city with shadows where children were vulnerable and predators could operate unchecked. Olsen does not write in sensational tones. Instead, he builds dread by showing how ordinary everything seemed on the surface. The genius of his narrative is that he does not only examine the killer, but also the ecosystem that enabled him. Police procedures at the time were flawed, social services were inadequate, and the culture often blamed teenagers rather than investigating their disappearances thoroughly. In this vacuum, Corll thrived. By the early 1970s, the number of missing boys was staggering, though no one had connected the dots. Corll had perfected his cycle of predation. Brooks and Henley acted as recruiters, promising friends parties, girls, or drugs, and then delivering them to Corll's house. Once inside, the boys never left alive. Their bodies were buried in rented boat sheds, shallow graves near a lake, and other hiding spots across Houston. Each new burial was a secret pact between Corll and his young accomplices, binding them deeper into complicity. For Brooks and Henley, fear and dependence kept them silent, but also the twisted rewards Corll offered. He gave them money, gifts, and the illusion of being part of something important. They were too young to fully understand that what they were part of was a death machine. The discovery of the crimes came not through police brilliance, but through chaos within the trio itself. In August 1973, Henley brought a friend and a girl to Corll's house. Corll exploded in anger. The presence of a female violated his twisted rituals. What followed was a tense standoff in which Henley, realizing his own life was at risk, turned the gun on Corll and killed him. That single act ended the Candyman's reign of terror, but it also opened the door to revelations that would horrify the nation. When Henley was taken into custody, he confessed not only to the shooting, but to the string of murders Corll had committed. Police were skeptical until he led them to burial sites where bodies were uncovered one after another. The scale of the carnage stunned investigators. 28 known victims were exhumed, making it one of the largest serial murder cases in American history. The emotional toll on the community was immense. Families who had been dismissed for years were suddenly confronted with the truth that their sons had not run away, but had been systematically hunted. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify remains, often relying on dental records and personal items. The process was gruesome and heartbreaking, but it was necessary to bring closure. Olsen recounts these moments with a mixture of empathy and journalistic clarity, never losing sight of the victims as individuals rather than statistics. Each boy had a story, a family, dreams that were extinguished by Corll's brutality. In reviewing Olsen's work, it is clear that his strength lies in balance. He does not glorify the killer, nor does he drown the reader in gratuitous detail. Instead, he assembles a mosaic of voices, detectives recalling their disbelief, parents expressing their grief, neighbors realizing too late what had been happening next door. This multiplicity of perspectives turns the book into more than just a true crime account. It becomes a sociological document of how evil can hide in plain sight. Readers are left not only horrified by Corll, but also unsettled by the failures of the system. Why were so many reports of missing boys brushed aside? Why did it take the murder of the murderer himself to bring the truth to light? These questions echo throughout Olsen's narrative, and they continue to resonate decades later. The Candyman case is a study in contrasts. On one side, there is the calculated cruelty of Dean Corll, who engineered his killings with precision and secrecy. On the other side, there is the innocence of the victims, many of whom trusted him because he seemed safe, even generous. Between these extremes lay the tragic figure of Henley, a teenager manipulated into complicity who ultimately became both killer and whistleblower. His decision to shoot Corll saved lives, but also sealed his fate as an accomplice to previous murders. The courts would judge him harshly, and his story raises complex questions about culpability, manipulation, and the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Henley's confession spilled out in a mixture of fear, relief, and bravado. At only 17 years old, he was exhausted from years of complicity and manipulation. He told detectives how Corll had trained him to lure victims, how he had been offered money for every boy delivered, how Brooks had been the first to become entangled, and how Henley eventually became the more active recruiter. Detectives listened with skepticism at first, but as he guided them to the burial sites, the enormity of the crime became undeniable. They dug through sandy soil near Lake Sam Rayburn, through the hard-packed earth of a rented boat shed, and through fields on the edge of Houston. Each site yielded bodies bound, gagged, and in various stages of decomposition. The sheer number shocked the officers, some of whom had never seen more than one homicide victim at a time. Now they were unearthing mass graves of teenage boys. The stench, the sight of small shoes and tattered clothing, and the realization that these were children who had been written off as runaways, filled seasoned investigators with rage and sorrow. The national media descended on Houston, dubbing the crimes the Houston mass murders. For a city eager to project growth and prosperity, the revelation was devastating. Headlines screamed of the Candyman, the Pied Piper of Houston, who had slaughtered boys under the noses of neighbors and police. Families who had fought for years to convince authorities that their sons had not simply fled home life were suddenly vindicated, but their vindication came at the cost of unimaginable grief. Mothers and fathers stood at crime scenes, clutching photographs of their missing children, begging to know if their sons were among the bodies being recovered. Identification was slow. In the days before DNA technology, investigators relied on dental charts, scars, and the testimony of friends who remembered clothing. Each confirmation brought closure, but also tore open wounds. Dean Corll was dead and thus beyond earthly justice, but Brooks and Henley were very much alive and had to face the courts. Their roles became the subject of endless debate. Were they victims, groomed and coerced by a manipulative predator, or were they willing accomplices who had chosen to profit from murder? The truth, as Olsen portrays, is complicated. Brooks was younger and perhaps more passive, but he had still helped deliver boys to Corll. Henley had recruited many victims and had even participated in the killings, yet he was also the one who ended Corll's reign by pulling the trigger. Jurors and judges wrestled with these contradictions. Ultimately, both young men were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. Henley received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never be free again. To this day, he remains a controversial figure, giving interviews from prison in which he vacillates between remorse and self-justification. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. It forced a reckoning within Houston about how vulnerable children could vanish without provoking urgency. It exposed the weaknesses in police systems that too quickly dismissed missing boys as runaways. And it reminded parents across America that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Dean Corll had been the man with the candy, the quiet neighbor, the polite son helping his mother's business. There had been no flashing neon sign of danger, only subtle oddities that hindsight later magnified. In that sense, the case became a chilling lesson. Predators often hide in plain sight, cloaked in normalcy. Jack Olsen's narrative emphasizes not only the horror of the crimes, but also the human dimension. He sketches portraits of the victims, giving them back their dignity. They were not nameless statistics, but boys with lives and dreams. Some were aspiring musicians, others simply restless teenagers seeking adventure. Their disappearance left holes in families that could never be filled. Olsen also paints Houston itself as a character in the story, a city caught between rapid modernization and deep neglect. He describes streets where kids wandered without supervision, neighborhoods where poverty eroded the fabric of community, and institutions too overstretched to notice the growing list of missing boys. This sociological lens elevates the book beyond crime reporting, turning it into a reflection on society's responsibility toward its youth. Reading The Man with the Candy is not easy. The subject matter is gruesome, and Olsen does not shy away from the brutality of Corll's methods, yet he avoids lurid sensationalism. Instead, he writes with restraint, using the horror not to shock gratuitously, but to illuminate the scale of the tragedy. For modern readers, the book also functions as an early example of investigative true crime writing, preceding the genre boom that would come decades later. Olsen's style is meticulous, empathetic, and relentless in its pursuit of truth. He asks hard questions about complicity, about the line between victim and perpetrator, and about the societal blind spots that allowed Corll to thrive. The psychology of Corll himself remains an enigma. He left no diaries or confessions, no manifestos to explain his motives. What can be pieced together comes from the testimony of Brooks and Henley, from the patterns of his crimes, and from the impressions of those who knew him. He was controlling, secretive, and sexually sadistic. His need for dominance escalated over time, moving from grooming boys to enslaving them, from fantasy to torture and murder. He seemed to relish the control as much as the act of killing. For criminologists, the case is a grim study in how predatory desires can metastasize into serial homicide when unchecked by law or conscience. The story also forces reflection on the vulnerability of adolescence. Many of Corll's victims were boys in transitional phases of life, caught between childhood and adulthood. They were searching for identity, independence, or simply distraction. Corll identified those desires and exploited them with ruthless precision. He offered belonging, fun, or escape, only to trap them in a nightmare. This manipulation highlights how predators weaponize trust and need. In reviewing this dynamic, Olsen underscores the importance of vigilance, of communities listening when children go missing, and of systems that treat every disappearance as urgent rather than optional. As the investigation unfolded in 1973, Houston police were overwhelmed. The number of remains being recovered demanded resources far beyond a typical homicide case. Dozens of detectives, forensic experts, and medical examiners worked around the clock. They had to preserve evidence, identify bodies, and notify families, all while under the relentless gaze of the media. The case became a national story not only for its scale but for its grotesque details. Americans were fascinated and horrified that such evil had festered largely unnoticed in a major city. For Houston officials, it was a public relations nightmare, but for the families it was simply devastation. Olsen writes of mothers collapsing when told of confirmation, of fathers who raged against police for years of disbelief, of siblings who grew up haunted by the absence. In analyzing the cultural response, one can see how the Candyman murders shifted perceptions of safety. Before the case, the idea of serial killers targeting large numbers of children was almost unimaginable. Afterward, awareness grew that communities needed better systems to protect their youth. The case influenced how missing person reports were handled, slowly changing policies to treat runaways with more seriousness. Though progress was uneven, the legacy of the murders can be traced in later reforms. The debate over Brooks and Henley's culpability has never truly ended. Supporters argue that they were children manipulated by a sadistic adult, that their participation was coerced through fear, dependency, and psychological grooming. Critics insist that at some point they crossed the line into willing accomplices, motivated by money and a sense of power. The truth likely lies in the painful grey area in between. What is undeniable is that without them, Corll could not have killed on such a scale. They were his recruiters, his facilitators, the extensions of his predatory reach. Henley's final act of killing Corll complicates his legacy, making him both the end of the horror and part of the horror itself. As Olsen's book progresses, the reader is left with a bitter truth. Justice in such cases is always incomplete. The victims are gone, their futures stolen. The killer is dead beyond accountability. The accomplices are imprisoned, but punishment cannot erase the suffering. What remains is memory, documentation, and the hope that by telling the story, society learns vigilance. The Man with the Candy endures as a classic of true crime literature because it refuses to let the victims be forgotten. It insists that behind every headline there are lives worth remembering, and behind every atrocity there are lessons society must absorb or risk repeating. In the weeks after the discovery of the burial sites, the city of Houston lived in a state of shock. Reporters crowded the streets, vans from national television stations lined up near police headquarters, and neighbors stared silently at the house where Dean Corll had lived his double life. It became a macabre landmark, a symbol of betrayal and horror. Journalists tried to interview anyone who had known him, piecing together scraps of normality that now seemed sinister. A shopkeeper remembered how polite Corll was when buying supplies. A neighbor recalled him mowing his lawn, waving casually, never hinting at the depravity inside his walls. This ordinariness was the most disturbing element of all. If such a man could commit these crimes while projecting total normalcy, then what did that say about the ability of any community to recognize evil before it exploded? The investigation forced police to re-evaluate every missing boy's case from the past 4 years. Suddenly, dozens of files previously stamped as runaways were reopened. Some of those boys were now identified among the exhumed remains. Others were still unaccounted for, leading to speculation that the true number of victims might be even higher than the official 28. Each file carried the weight of parents who had begged for help, of siblings who had searched, of neighborhoods that had whispered rumors. Detectives admitted privately that they had been too quick to dismiss the disappearances, assuming that teenage boys simply chose to flee unstable homes. The Candyman case exposed how those assumptions created a blind spot wide enough for a serial killer to hide in plain sight. For criminologists and psychologists, the case became a disturbing subject of study. Dean Corll did not fit the profile of flamboyant killers who sought fame. He was methodical, secretive, and uninterested in public recognition. His satisfaction came entirely from control and cruelty, not from taunting the authorities or boasting about his crimes. This made him harder to detect. He maintained a low profile, holding ordinary jobs, living in modest houses, and blending into the fabric of Houston. His reliance on Brooks and Henley to lure victims demonstrated a chilling efficiency. He understood that teenagers would trust their peers more than a middle-aged man, so he turned his recruits into extensions of himself. This outsourcing of trust allowed him to scale his killing spree, creating a conveyor belt of victims. The psychological manipulation of Brooks and Henley also highlighted how predators can transform vulnerable youth into accomplices, blurring the line between victimhood and guilt. Court proceedings for Brooks and Henley dragged on as the legal system tried to make sense of their dual roles. Defense attorneys argued that the boys had been groomed, bribed, and threatened, incapable of resisting Corll's dominance. Prosecutors countered that by the time of the later murders, both had participated willingly, lured victims knowingly, and sometimes even joined in the killings. The juries were forced to navigate a moral labyrinth. In the end, Brooks was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, though he would remain incarcerated for decades. Henley received multiple life sentences reflecting his deeper involvement. The sentences did little to satisfy grieving families who believed nothing could equate to the lives stolen. Some parents publicly expressed fury that the boys were not executed. Others, acknowledging their youth, felt a conflicted pity. The community itself was divided, torn between anger and the uncomfortable recognition that the accomplices had been children themselves when the horror began. The aftermath of the case rippled through the 1970s. Houston carried a stigma whispered about as the city where the Candyman prowled. Parents grew more cautious, setting stricter curfews, warning children never to trust strangers, never to accept rides, never to wander alone. The idea of the friendly neighbor handing out candy became poisoned by association. Across America, the phrase stranger danger gained traction, fueled by stories like Corll's that revealed how predators exploited trust. The case fed into a growing cultural awareness of child safety, shaping public service campaigns and influencing how schools, churches, and community organizations educated children about boundaries and caution. Olsen's book captured this cultural shift. By meticulously documenting the sequence of events, he provided not only a record of the crimes, but also a mirror for society. Readers were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that vigilance had failed at every level. Families were dismissed, police were complacent, neighbors were blind, and institutions were ill-prepared. The result was a massacre hidden in plain sight. Olsen's prose avoids melodrama, instead letting the facts accumulate until the horror becomes undeniable. His attention to the victim's humanity counters the tendency of true crime narratives to obsess over the killer. By giving voice to the boys who were lost, he reminds readers that the tragedy is measured not in the infamy of Corll, but in the silenced lives of children. In reflecting on the book, one can see why it remains a classic. It is not just the story of a killer, but of an entire community's vulnerability. It reveals how evil thrives when oversight collapses, how predators exploit the cracks in social systems, and how the victims of crime are often those already marginalized. Olsen's investigative rigor, combined with his sensitivity, created a template for later true crime writing. He was not content to write a lurid tale. He insisted on context, on accountability, on empathy. This elevates the narrative from tabloid to literature. The legacy of Dean Corll remains grim. His name is etched alongside other notorious American killers, yet he is less known to the general public than figures like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. Perhaps this is because his crimes targeted boys from poor families, children whose disappearances did not command national attention until the bodies were uncovered. It is a haunting reminder of how social class influences visibility. The boys were as valuable as any child, but their marginalization made them easier prey and less newsworthy in their absence. Only when the scale of the deaths became undeniable did the media swarm. This disparity underscores one of Olsen's underlying themes: society's failure to value every child equally. From a modern perspective, the case also raises questions about rehabilitation, about the possibility of redemption for those drawn into evil as youths. Henley's ongoing imprisonment sparks debate. Some see him as irredeemable, a killer who lured friends to their deaths and deserves nothing but confinement. Others see him as a teenager, ensnared by a predator, whose eventual act of killing Corll saved lives and demonstrated capacity for moral choice. This debate has persisted for decades, fueled by interviews Henley has given from prison, where he alternately expresses remorse and defensiveness. Brooks, more withdrawn, remains a quieter figure, his life overshadowed by his role in the atrocities. Their stories remind us that justice is rarely simple, that guilt and victimhood can coexist uneasily within the same individual. The Man with the Candy leaves the reader with a lingering unease that extends beyond the final page. It is not a tale with closure or redemption, but a chronicle of devastation. The boys remain gone, the families scarred, the city forever marked. Yet, in telling their story, Olsen ensures they are not forgotten. He transforms a grotesque chapter of American crime into a warning and a memorial. The book asks us to look harder at the people around us, to take seriously the cries of the vulnerable, and to recognize that predators often wear the blandest masks. In that recognition lies the only measure of protection we can offer against future horrors. In the years following the trial, Houston tried to move forward, but the memory of the murders lingered like a scar beneath the city's surface. Every new missing child report triggered echoes of the Candyman. Every rumor of a runaway revived old fears. Parents who had lived through the horror became hypervigilant, and their anxieties passed down to the next generation. In some neighborhoods, the story was told almost as folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the dangers of trusting strangers. Yet it was not folklore but grim reality, a reminder that beneath ordinary appearances, unimaginable cruelty had once flourished. The surviving families struggled with grief that never fully receded. Some became advocates for missing children, pressing authorities to improve procedures and insisting that no report be dismissed without thorough investigation. Others withdrew into private sorrow, unable to bear the constant reminders. The absence of their sons haunted every holiday, every family gathering, every photograph where a smile was missing. The police force, too, carried scars. Detectives who had dug up shallow graves spoke of nightmares, of the smell that clung to their clothes, of the images they could never erase. For some, the case became a turning point in their careers, a reminder of why vigilance mattered. Training programs began emphasizing the seriousness of missing juveniles, though change came slowly and unevenly. Across the nation, other police departments watched Houston's ordeal and reconsidered how they handled runaway reports. It was not a revolution overnight, but the Candyman case contributed to the gradual evolution of policy. Years later, when organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were established, the lessons of Houston were woven into their mission. For the community at large, the murders became a kind of collective trauma. People who had grown up in the era described a loss of innocence, a shattering of trust. Before, the idea of children wandering freely through neighborhoods had been normal. Afterward, the atmosphere was one of caution and suspicion. Children were warned not to accept candy or rides, not to enter homes, not to trust even familiar faces without verification. Some lamented the loss of freedom, but others saw it as necessary vigilance. The cultural shift toward stranger danger education was fueled by cases like Corll's, where the friendly adult mask concealed predation. Jack Olsen's portrayal of these ripple effects is one of the book's enduring strengths. He does not simply end with the trial or the body count. He traces the aftershocks, showing how communities absorb trauma and how memory shapes behavior long after the killer is gone. His focus on the families ensures that the victims remain central, their absence a void that continues to speak. By giving space to parents' grief, siblings' memories, and the ongoing struggles of survivors, Olsen resists the temptation to make Corll the star of the narrative. Instead, the killer remains a dark shadow while the spotlight shines on those who suffered. This approach is both ethical and effective, grounding the horror in humanity rather than spectacle. From a literary perspective, the book stands as an early exemplar of narrative non-fiction in true crime. Olsen combines investigative reporting with novelistic detail, reconstructing scenes with precision, but also with an eye for atmosphere. He brings readers into the rooms where detectives argued, into the courtrooms where lawyers sparred, into the kitchens where families waited for news. This immersive quality makes the book compelling while preserving factual integrity. It is not sensationalism but storytelling in service of truth. For later generations of true crime writers, Olsen's method provided a model: respect for victims, attention to social context, and commitment to detail. The case itself remains studied in criminology courses as a grim illustration of how serial crimes can escalate unchecked. Dean Corll's ability to maintain secrecy for years demonstrates the danger of underestimating patterns of disappearance. Modern investigators often reference the Houston mass murders when discussing the importance of linking missing person cases and recognizing clusters. The role of accomplices also provides material for debate, raising questions about the psychology of recruitment, the threshold of coercion, and the ethics of sentencing minors entangled in adult crimes. In these discussions, Henley and Brooks become case studies, their lives dissected as examples of how children can be both manipulated and complicit. Decades later, interviews with Henley continue to stir controversy. Some viewers interpret his demeanor as cold, others as resigned. He sometimes insists he saved lives by killing Corll, framing himself as both victim and reluctant hero. Yet transcripts of his confessions and the testimony of families make clear his deep involvement. The ambiguity ensures that debate never ceases. It forces readers and viewers alike to confront uncomfortable truths about agency, responsibility, and the corrosive power of influence. Brooks, less vocal, serves as a quieter reminder that silence and passivity can also aid evil. His life in prison is marked by withdrawal, a shadow of the boy who once thought he had found a friend in Corll. For those who study American serial killers, the Candyman case often seems overshadowed by later, more publicized figures. Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer became household names, their stories retold endlessly. Corll, despite his staggering body count, remains less notorious in popular culture. One reason is timing. His crimes ended in 1973, before the true crime boom of the late 20th century. Another reason is the nature of his victims, working-class boys whose families lacked influence to demand national coverage until the bodies were discovered. Yet, within criminology circles, Corll's name is well known, cited as one of the deadliest child killers in American history. For those who read Olsen's book, the absence of fame is almost merciful. It prevents Corll from achieving the notoriety he never sought in life. The deeper tragedy lies in the boys themselves. Olsen painstakingly reconstructs their lives, giving each one individuality. They were sons who played guitar, who dreamed of jobs, who cracked jokes with friends, who wrestled with school and adolescence. By restoring their humanity, the book resists the flattening effect of statistics. 28 is a number, but 28 lives, each with stories, creates a chorus of loss. Families describe the small details they remembered, the sound of laughter, a favorite shirt, the way a boy ran down the street. These memories are what linger long after the facts of the case fade. They are what transform the narrative from a catalogue of crime into a memorial. For readers today, the man with the candy remains relevant not only as history, but as a warning. Predators still exist, and society still grapples with how to protect the vulnerable. The book teaches vigilance, empathy, and the necessity of listening when children go missing. It also underscores the need to hold systems accountable to ensure that no disappearance is dismissed without care. In this way, the tragedy of Houston may contribute to the safety of others, a grim legacy forged from suffering. Time passed, but the memory of the Candyman murders continued to ripple outward, influencing not just Houston, but the broader landscape of American awareness about crime and vulnerability. In the mid to late 1970s, as communities wrestled with fear, newspapers occasionally revisited the case, reminding readers that the wounds were still fresh and the questions still unresolved. Some journalists speculated about additional victims, hinting that the real toll might have exceeded even the official 28. Rumors circulated of boys who had vanished and were never confirmed among the recovered bodies. Families lived with gnawing uncertainty, wondering if their missing sons were still out there somewhere, or if they had been swallowed into Corll's abyss without recognition. Forensic science at the time lacked the tools to answer many of these questions. Identification relied on dental charts, physical characteristics, and personal effects, methods that left room for doubt. Years later, advances in DNA testing would allow some of the unidentified remains to be conclusively matched to names, providing long-delayed closure. But in the immediate aftermath, families were left in limbo. That limbo became a permanent state for some who would die without ever knowing their child's fate. This unending uncertainty is one of the cruelest legacies of serial crime, as Olsen emphasizes in his book. The brutality is not confined to the moment of killing, but extends across decades of grief and unanswered questions. The cultural resonance of the case also seeped into art, literature, and conversation about evil. Writers and filmmakers drawn to the psychology of killers sometimes referenced the Candyman obliquely, seeing in Corll a prototype of the quiet neighbor monster. Yet Olsen's account remains the definitive version because it refuses to fictionalize or sensationalize. His method is to let the horror speak through accumulation of fact, testimony, and the stark contrast between surface normalcy and hidden violence. This approach sets a standard for ethical true crime, resisting the temptation to turn killers into celebrities. Instead, he frames Corll as an absence of humanity, a void around which the stories of victims and families revolve. As the decades advanced, Houston grew, skyscrapers rose, and the city remade its image. Yet older residents remembered, in certain neighborhoods the story remained alive, passed down like an oral history. Parents warned children not with abstract threats, but with the concrete example of what had happened in their own city. Teachers used the case as a reminder that danger sometimes comes disguised as kindness. Police cadets learned of it as part of training, a case study in investigative failure and eventual revelation. Thus, the Candyman became both ghost and lesson, a presence that lingered in cautionary tales. Meanwhile, Brooks and Henley lived out their days in prison. Brooks, the quieter of the two, adapted to the monotonous rhythms of incarceration. He expressed remorse in limited ways but mostly kept to himself, a man whose life had been defined by the terrible decisions of his youth. Henley, by contrast, remained a figure of fascination. Journalists sought interviews, curious about his dual role as accomplice and killer of the killer. In those interviews, he sometimes cast himself as a reluctant participant, other times as someone who had made peace with his responsibility. The inconsistency of his accounts frustrated families of victims who saw in him a refusal to accept full blame. To criminologists, his case remained complex, illustrating how manipulation and agency can intertwine. He was both boy and predator, victim and perpetrator, savior and destroyer. The debate over how to perceive Henley reflects broader questions about justice. Should the law treat manipulated minors differently, even when their actions contributed to mass murder? Should the act of killing Corll, which ended the spree, mitigate the punishment for the years of complicity? The courts decided firmly that his guilt outweighed any claim to leniency, but public opinion remains divided. Some argue he should have been paroled after decades as a recognition of his youth and his pivotal act of stopping Corll. Others argue that releasing him would dishonor the victims and reopen wounds. Each parole hearing reignites the conflict, as families plead for continued incarceration and advocates debate the ethics. From a psychological perspective, Corll's manipulation of Brooks and Henley demonstrates the predatory use of grooming techniques. He provided gifts, created dependency, blurred boundaries, and then escalated demands. By the time the boys realized the true nature of what they were involved in, their complicity tied them to him irrevocably. Fear, loyalty, and the intoxication of belonging kept them trapped. This dynamic mirrors patterns seen in cults and abusive relationships, where victims become collaborators under pressure and control. Olsen's exploration of this aspect gives the book depth beyond crime reporting. It becomes an analysis of power, exploitation, and the fragility of adolescence under manipulation. The victims themselves remain the heart of the narrative. Olsen records their names, their ages, their families, and the circumstances of their disappearances. Reading their stories creates a chorus of interrupted lives. Each was a boy at a formative stage, caught between childhood and adulthood, searching for adventure or escape. Corll identified that liminality and exploited it mercilessly. He turned their trust into the mechanism of their destruction. By detailing their individuality, Olsen resists the reduction of victims to numbers. He restores their humanity, ensuring that they remain central. For readers, the effect is devastating but necessary, grounding the horror in personal loss rather than abstract statistics. As the true crime genre has grown in popularity, many books and documentaries revisit the great cases of history. The Candyman case stands apart because of its sheer scale and because of the youth of the victims. It also stands apart because of Olsen's treatment, which avoids spectacle and emphasizes responsibility. In reviewing the book, one can appreciate its endurance not only as reportage, but as a work of conscience. Olsen insists that society look at the victims, look at the failures, and refuse to look away. That insistence makes the book still relevant today, decades after the events. The resonance of the Candyman murders also shaped conversations about community responsibility. Neighbors who had once ignored suspicious behavior began to wonder if they should have spoken up. Teachers questioned whether they had missed signs. Police acknowledged their errors. The collective reckoning was painful but instructive. It suggested that vigilance is not only the job of authorities, but of communities. Evil thrives when silence prevails, when discomfort prevents confrontation, when assumptions replace action. In that sense, the murders were not only the work of one man and his accomplices, but also the result of a society that failed to hear the alarm sounded by grieving families. Olsen's book crystallizes this truth, turning it into a permanent indictment of indifference. As time marched into the 1980s and 1990s, the case of Dean Corll began to fade from national headlines, overshadowed by new crimes and new tragedies. But for Houston and for the families, it never disappeared. Memorial services were held, anniversaries marked with vigils, and community groups kept alive the memory of the boys who never came home. Some parents became activists, channeling grief into efforts to improve how missing children's cases were handled. They supported the creation of hotlines, helped advocate for the use of milk carton campaigns, and pressed for stronger cooperation between police departments. The shadow of the Candyman murders made them determined that no other family should endure the silence and indifference they had faced. The cultural environment of the 1980s, with its heightened concern about child safety, found in the Corll case a chilling precedent. When national campaigns warned children not to talk to strangers, when schools introduced programs about saying no and seeking help, the ghosts of Houston hovered in the background. Parents who had once dismissed such warnings now clung to them, their fear sharpened by the memory of how easily Corll had lured boys with promises of candy, rides, and adventure. The case became part of the unspoken history behind the stranger danger era, a silent contributor to the collective anxiety about child predators. Meanwhile, criminologists continued to dissect the psychology of Corll. Unlike killers who sought notoriety, Corll seemed motivated solely by sadistic compulsion. He had no interest in games with police or public confessions. His mask of ordinariness was his shield, and his reliance on young accomplices made him uniquely efficient. The lack of a clear manifesto or explanation leaves his motives opaque. Some speculated about childhood experiences, about repression, about hidden rage. Others argued that he was simply a sociopath whose desires escalated unchecked. Whatever the root, his capacity for cruelty was vast, and his lack of remorse was evident in the consistency with which he repeated his crimes. He was methodical, ritualistic, and detached, qualities that make him a textbook example of predatory pathology. Olsen's narrative refuses to reduce Corll to pathology alone. He situates the killer within the social fabric of Houston, pointing out how the failures of institutions and the indifference of society created fertile ground. The book insists that while Corll bears ultimate responsibility, the scale of the tragedy was multiplied by systemic negligence. This perspective is sobering because it transfers part of the burden to all who ignored the warning signs. The theme resonates with readers who realize that vigilance is a communal duty, not just a personal one. In prison, Henley aged from a teenager into a middle-aged man, still serving life sentences. Each decade brought parole hearings and with them renewed public debate. Victims' families gathered to testify against release, insisting that the memory of their sons demanded perpetual punishment. Henley's supporters argued that he had been a child under the sway of a manipulator, that he had shown courage in finally killing Corll, and that decades behind bars had already served justice. Yet parole was always denied, the weight of the crimes too heavy to permit freedom. For families, the hearings reopened wounds, forcing them to relive the loss and to listen once more to the details of how their sons had been lured and killed. The cycle of pain ensured that healing could never be complete. Brooks, less visible, remained in prison as well, his life consumed by regret and monotony. Unlike Henley, he rarely spoke publicly, his silence a kind of penance or withdrawal. He represented the quieter side of complicity, the boy who followed along, who accepted gifts and turned a blind eye until it was too late. His story underscores how passivity can be as dangerous as action when it enables evil. As the decades rolled forward, forensic science began to revisit old remains. DNA testing, unavailable in the 1970s, provided new clarity. Some unidentified victims were finally given names, families given closure after years of uncertainty. The advancement of science served as a reminder that truth can emerge even after decades, but also that it comes too late for those who lived their lives in not knowing. Each new identification was both a relief and a fresh wave of grief, as parents or siblings learned definitively what had happened. The city of Houston, now a modern metropolis, still bore the invisible scar. New generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, piecing together the tale from books, old news clippings, and the occasional documentary. The name Candyman became shorthand for betrayal and horror. Some resisted speaking of it at all, wishing the memory would fade. Others insisted on remembering, believing that forgetting invited repetition. In this tension, the legacy of Corll lingered. Olsen's book, reissued over the years, kept the narrative alive for new readers. Its continued relevance testifies to the thoroughness of his research and the resonance of his storytelling. Readers encountering the book decades later felt the same chill as those who read it at publication, a testament to the enduring power of fact-based narrative. The style holds up, combining detail with empathy, ensuring that the humanity of victims outshines the shadow of the killer. The broader implications of the case continue to inform criminology and sociology. It demonstrates how marginalized populations are at heightened risk, how systemic neglect compounds vulnerability, and how communities can fail to protect their own. It shows the dangers of assuming that missing teenagers are merely rebellious runaways. And it illustrates how predators exploit not only individual weakness but institutional apathy. These lessons remain urgent, echoed in contemporary discussions about trafficking, exploitation, and missing persons. For modern readers, engaging with the story is both harrowing and instructive. It demands empathy for the victims, awareness of social failures, and recognition of the complexity of justice. The book functions not just as history but as a warning, a testament, and a call to vigilance. The horror of the Candyman is not confined to the past. It reverberates as a reminder that vigilance, compassion, and accountability are always necessary to guard against repetition. By the turn of the millennium, the Candyman murders had become a grim reference point in the annals of American crime, known more to scholars and dedicated true crime readers than to the general public. Yet the pain among the families remained undiminished. Some of the parents had aged into their 70s or 80s, still carrying the absence of their sons as a daily wound. Others had passed away, leaving behind siblings and cousins to remember the boys. Community activists who had fought to keep the memory alive sometimes felt frustration that newer generations did not grasp the enormity of what had happened. But history is like that, selective and fading. And only through books like Olsen's and through the vigilance of families was the story preserved. The details of Corll's cruelty remain shocking even decades later. Survivors of the investigation recalled the torture board found in his home, a piece of plywood with holes drilled for restraints, a crude device that symbolized the systematic way he dehumanized his victims. It became an artifact of horror in police archives, a reminder of the meticulous planning that underlay his crimes. That such an object could exist in a suburban house undetected for years exemplified the banality of evil. Corll's house was not isolated or hidden. It was on a normal street where neighbors waved to each other, and yet inside he conducted atrocities. This juxtaposition is one of the most haunting aspects of the case, reminding us that darkness often coexists with everyday normality. The case also continued to fuel discussions about the media's role in shaping public memory. At the time of the discovery, coverage was intense, but as years passed, other crimes drew attention and the story receded. Unlike more flamboyant killers who engaged with the press, Corll left no interviews or taunts, so his name did not echo as loudly in popular culture. Yet the scale of his crimes was greater than many who became infamous. This disparity shows how narratives are constructed not solely by the severity of crime, but by the spectacle surrounding it. For some, this is a relief, preventing Corll from achieving posthumous notoriety. For others, it is troubling, fearing that the diminished attention may lead to diminished vigilance. In prisons across Texas, Henley remained a figure of curiosity. Documentaries sought his participation, journalists requested interviews, and he occasionally obliged, speaking with a mix of candor and self-preservation. He described Corll's dominance, the lure of money, the fear that kept him compliant. He also emphasized his act of killing Corll, casting it as both self-defense and rescue. Critics argued that his narrative downplayed the suffering he had inflicted on victims before that night. Families who listened to his words found them hollow, believing that true remorse would not include self-justification. The tension between his self-image and public perception is emblematic of the difficulty in assessing moral responsibility when manipulation and agency intertwine. Brooks lived more quietly, his story less publicized. Inmates who knew him described a man withdrawn, carrying regret, avoiding the spotlight. His silence left more room for speculation, but it also avoided the appearance of seeking attention. He lived out the consequences of choices made as a boy, his entire adult life defined by the orbit of Corll. In him, we see the long shadow of manipulation, how one predatory figure can distort the trajectory of another's life permanently. As forensic methods advanced into the 21st century, new identifications occasionally emerged. Families were contacted, remains matched, names restored. These moments brought bittersweet relief. After decades of uncertainty, knowing was better than wondering, but the confirmation reopened grief. Olsen's decision to foreground the victims means that even decades later, readers can imagine the relief and sorrow of these identifications. Each name restored is a reminder that behind every headline is a person, behind every statistic, a story. The case also entered academic discussion in fields beyond criminology. Sociologists examined it as an example of how class and marginalization affect visibility. The victims were largely working-class boys, many from unstable homes, and their disappearances were too easily dismissed. Had they been from wealthier families, would police have acted differently? Historians of culture studied how the case influenced perceptions of childhood safety and contributed to the rise of protective parenting in late 20th century America. Psychologists used it to illustrate grooming, coercion, and the capacity for ordinary-seeming individuals to commit atrocities. In these ways, the legacy of Corll extended into disciplines that sought to extract lessons from the horror. Reading Olsen's account today, one cannot help but feel the weight of inevitability in the narrative. Each disappearance described is another missed chance for intervention, another warning ignored. The accumulation of missed opportunities is crushing, and yet it is this accumulation that conveys the true scale of the tragedy. It was not one failure, but many repeated over years that allowed Corll to continue. This theme resonates with readers who see in it a cautionary tale about the cost of indifference. The book is not merely about a killer, but about the silence that enabled him. In Houston itself, physical reminders of the case have mostly vanished. The houses where crimes occurred have been torn down or renovated, the boat shed demolished, the fields developed. Yet memory lingers in stories, in the archives of newspapers, in the oral histories of families. The city has grown so large that new residents may never hear of the Candyman unless they seek it out. But for those who lived through it, the memory is indelible. The absence of physical markers perhaps protects the community from being defined solely by horror, but it also risks erasure. Books like The Man with the Candy ensure that erasure does not occur, that the names and faces of the victims are preserved in print, if not in monuments. The endurance of Olsen's work is due in part to his refusal to let the narrative drift into sensationalism. He understood that true horror lies not in exaggerated descriptions, but in the plain facts of cruelty juxtaposed with innocence. His writing style compels readers to imagine the lives interrupted, the ordinariness of the boys before they crossed Corll's path, and the ordinary settings where extraordinary evil unfolded. In this approach, he models an ethical way of writing about crime, one that respects the dignity of victims and avoids granting the killer undue mystique. The story of Dean Corll and the boys he destroyed continues to echo because it touches something fundamental about trust and betrayal. Communities depend on the assumption that neighbors are safe, that the people who live beside us share a basic respect for life. When that assumption is violated in such a grotesque way, the wound penetrates deeply. The Candyman murders were not simply a string of crimes. They were a collapse of communal trust. Parents realized that the smiling man who handed out candy could be the same man who tied their sons to a torture board. Children learned that the boundaries between friend and predator were not as clear as they had believed. This betrayal reverberated long after the headlines faded, shaping the way Houston and eventually much of America thought about safety. In the book, Olsen highlights small moments that capture the enormity of the loss. A mother describing the empty chair at the dinner table, a sibling recalling how he kept expecting his brother to come back through the door, a detective confessing that the sound of shovels hitting the earth haunted him for years. These fragments accumulate into a mosaic of grief. They remind us that the case is not only about the killer, but about the ripple effects of absence. Each boy's death created circles of pain that spread through families, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. The case also illustrates the paradox of evil that hides in plain sight. Corll was not a drifter, not a flamboyant criminal. He was the man next door, polite, industrious, seemingly harmless. This ordinariness allowed him to kill with impunity, shielded by the assumption that monsters look different from the rest of us. The lesson is uncomfortable. The most dangerous predators often cultivate the appearance of normality. Olsen makes this point quietly but powerfully, forcing readers to confront the reality that vigilance cannot rely on stereotypes. Over time, the debate about Brooks and Henley's responsibility evolved. Scholars, journalists, and the public revisited the case with shifting perspectives. Some argued that Henley in particular should be understood as a child soldier of sorts, recruited and corrupted by a manipulative adult. Others insisted that his active participation and recruitment of friends marked him as more than a victim. The truth lies in the tension between those views. What cannot be denied is that Corll's use of teenage accomplices magnified his reach and prolonged his spree. Without them, he could not have sustained the cycle of abduction and murder. Their complicity, however coerced, was essential. This uncomfortable fact underscores the way predators exploit not just victims but also bystanders, turning them into instruments of destruction. As the decades rolled on, popular culture occasionally returned to the case. Documentaries revisited the horror. True crime anthologies included The Candyman among America's deadliest killers, and podcasts analyzed the psychology of the trio. Each retelling emphasized different aspects, but Olsen's book remained the foundation. It had been written close to the events, with access to fresh testimony, and with a journalistic rigor that preserved the rawness of the era. Later accounts often built upon his work, confirming his role as the chronicler of record. In academic circles, the case continued to serve as a case study in systemic failure. Law enforcement agencies used it as an example of why missing child reports must be taken seriously. Criminology courses analyzed Corll's grooming methods, his recruitment of accomplices, and his ability to hide within suburban anonymity. Psychologists pointed to the case when discussing the impact of manipulation on adolescent development. Each discipline drew its own lessons, ensuring that the horror was at least transformed into knowledge. Yet for the families, these intellectual analyses could never replace the sons they had lost. For them, the case was not a subject of study but a lifelong wound. Olsen captures this distinction by giving voice to parents who resisted closure. They argued that closure was an illusion, that nothing could replace the child who was gone. They lived with daily reminders, birthdays uncelebrated, milestones unmet, futures erased. This insistence on the permanence of loss is a crucial corrective to the temptation to package crime stories as neat narratives with resolution. The Candyman case has no resolution, only aftermath. The role of memory in shaping identity is another theme Olsen weaves into his account. Communities that lived through the murders carried the memory like a hidden scar, influencing behavior in subtle ways. Some residents became more protective, others more suspicious. Trust eroded, routines changed, neighborhoods grew quieter. The presence of absence altered the social fabric. For younger generations who learned the story secondhand, the case became a mythic warning, shaping attitudes toward strangers, even if the details were not fully known. In this way, the legacy of Corll extended beyond the immediate victims to reshape an entire city's consciousness. For modern readers, the book invites reflection on how to honor victims without glorifying killers. Olsen achieves this balance by centering the boys, by treating Corll as a shadow rather than a protagonist. This approach is both ethical and effective, reminding us that the true measure of the story is not the cunning of the killer, but the humanity of those he destroyed. By preserving their names and stories, he resists the erasure that predators intend. As the new century progressed, the silence around Dean Corll's crimes was occasionally broken by anniversaries or by parole hearings for Elmer Henley. Each time he appeared before the parole board, the old wounds of the families were reopened. They gathered in hearing rooms or sent statements, voices cracking as they repeated the names of their sons and begged the board not to release the man who had delivered them to death. These hearings rarely lasted long, for the outcome was predictable. The enormity of the crimes, the weight of the pain, made parole politically and morally untenable. Yet the process itself served as a cruel ritual for families, forcing them to relive the details again and again. Some described it as reopening a coffin that could never be closed. The public interest that spiked during these hearings was a reminder that while the case might have faded from the national spotlight, it had never vanished completely. True crime enthusiasts rediscovered Olsen's book, and documentaries introduced the story to new audiences. Each generation that encountered it felt the same chill, the realization that such horror had unfolded in an ordinary city under the gaze of neighbors in the shadows of everyday life. The ordinariness of the setting remains one of the most terrifying aspects of the case. It strips away the illusion that monsters are obvious or distant. Corll was not a stranger from afar, but a man embedded within the community, blending into its routines while secretly dismantling its children. For law enforcement professionals, the case remained a touchstone for reform. The failures in handling missing person reports became lessons for training programs. Officers were reminded that dismissing a disappearance as a runaway could cost lives. Systems were slowly improved to track patterns, to share information across jurisdictions, and to respond with urgency. These changes did not eliminate tragedy, but they reduced the likelihood of another killer operating for years without detection. The Candyman murders thus became not only a story of horror, but also a catalyst for change, however belated. The victims, though, remained at the center for those who had loved them. Families created small memorials, photographs framed in living rooms, names carved into gravestones. Siblings carried memories into adulthood, some speaking publicly about the impact, others keeping the pain private. Their stories reveal the long shadow of crime, how it extends far beyond the act itself. Every marriage, every birth, every holiday is marked by the absence of the boy who should have been there. This generational grief is a theme Olsen captures with quiet power, showing that the aftermath of murder is not measured only in statistics, but in decades of sorrow. Dean Corll himself remains a cipher. Because he died at Henley's hand before arrest, he left no courtroom testimony, no psychiatric evaluation, no chance to explain or confess. What we know comes through the fragments left behind and the words of Brooks and Henley. This absence of direct voice makes him more shadow than man in the narrative, an enigma of cruelty without explanation. Some readers find this frustrating, wishing for insight into what drove him. Others see it as appropriate, denying him the posthumous platform that so many killers receive. Olsen's choice to minimize Corll's presence in the text reflects this stance. The story is not about understanding him, but about remembering those he destroyed. The enduring fascination with the case lies in part in its scale. 28 confirmed victims, possibly more, make Corll one of the deadliest serial killers in American history, yet he is less infamous than others with smaller body counts. This contradiction reveals how media and culture shape memory. Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer became notorious partly because of their charisma, their theatrics, or the sensational details of their cases. Corll, quiet and secretive, did not cultivate such infamy. His crimes were revealed all at once, through Henley's confession, rather than through a dramatic manhunt or trial. The lack of spectacle diminished his cultural footprint, though not the horror of his deeds. For those who study crime, however, Corll's name is etched in the black ledger of history. In Houston, urban development eventually erased many of the physical sites of the murders. Houses were torn down, lots repurposed, landscapes changed, yet the memory persists in archives and in the minds of those who lived through it. The erasure of physical markers creates a paradox. On one hand, it frees communities from being defined by horror. On the other hand, it risks forgetting, as new residents walk streets unaware of the darkness once hidden there. Olsen's book acts as a bulwark against forgetting, preserving in print what time erases from place. The moral questions raised by the case remain unsettled. How much blame should fall on Henley and Brooks, given their youth and manipulation? How should justice balance between accountability and recognition of coercion? How can society ensure that institutions respond to vulnerable children with seriousness rather than dismissal? These questions echo beyond Houston, resonating wherever children disappear, wherever predators exploit indifference. Olsen's narrative leaves them open, forcing readers to grapple with the discomfort rather than offering neat answers. For readers encountering the book decades after the events, the power lies in its refusal to let us look away. The story unfolds with relentless accumulation, each disappearance another reminder of warning signs ignored. By the time the bodies are uncovered, the weight of missed chances is unbearable. The horror is not only what Corll did, but what society failed to prevent. This recognition transforms the book from a crime story into a social indictment, one that remains relevant as long as children remain vulnerable and institutions remain fallible. As the 21st century advanced, the case of Dean Corll continued to resurface in waves, each time reminding new audiences of the scale of his crimes and the lessons embedded within them. True crime media, from books to television specials to podcasts, rediscovered the Candyman murders and reframed them for modern listeners. Each retelling brought with it a sense of disbelief, a renewed astonishment that so many boys could vanish without effective intervention. The disbelief was often followed by anger at the failures of the time, at the police who dismissed missing person reports, at the community that failed to recognize danger, and at the systems that allowed Corll to operate for years unchallenged. This anger demonstrates that the case is not only history, but a continuing touchstone for conversations about accountability. For those who had lived through the events, hearing the story revived in media was painful. Families of victims sometimes cooperated with documentaries, hoping to keep the memory of their sons alive, but other times resisted, fearing exploitation or sensationalism. They had learned that media attention can be a double-edged sword, offering recognition but also reopening wounds. Olsen's original book remained the most respected account because of its restraint and compassion, qualities sometimes lacking in newer retellings. His narrative continues to serve as a model for how true crime can honor victims without turning killers into celebrities. The psychological analysis of Corll remained speculative, for his death prevented any direct study. Some criminologists argued that his compulsion was rooted in sadistic sexual desire, that his killings escalated as tolerance for lesser acts diminished. Others suggested a need for absolute control, the pleasure derived not only from sexual violence but from the total domination of his victims' wills. Still others pointed to the influence of secrecy and opportunity, the way his circumstances provided him cover and collaborators. But, in the absence of personal testimony, the truth remains elusive. This ambiguity may be unsatisfying to those who seek clear motives, But it is also a reminder that evil does not always yield explanations. Sometimes it is simply the presence of cruelty in human form. The figure of Elmer Wayne Henley grew older in prison, his youthful face replaced by the lines of age. Photographs of him through the decades show a transformation from the teenager who shocked the world by confessing to mass murder to a middle-aged man still seeking parole. Each image is a reminder of time's passage, of the years he has lived behind bars, while the boys he delivered to Corll never grew old. Interviews with Henley revealed a man who oscillated between acknowledging guilt and defending himself, a contradiction that mirrors the complexity of his role. For some observers, his continued imprisonment is justice served. For others, it is a tragic reminder of how youth can be corrupted beyond repair. David Brooks, more withdrawn, faded into the obscurity of prison life. His silence meant fewer headlines, fewer debates, but his presence in the story remains important. He was the first to be lured by Corll, the first to cross the line into complicity, and his trajectory illustrates how predators exploit vulnerability to create accomplices. His life in prison is the shadow of a childhood choice, a lifetime spent under the weight of a single decision that spiraled into countless deaths. His story is quieter, but no less tragic, a testament to how evil radiates outward, consuming not only victims, but also those ensnared in its orbit. The legacy of the Candyman murders also shaped institutional practices in law enforcement and child protection. Training manuals cited the case as an example of the cost of indifference. Conferences on missing children included it in their history of reform. Non-profit organizations dedicated to child safety referenced Houston as one of the pivotal tragedies that demonstrated the need for national coordination. These institutional memories transformed horror into policy, attempting to ensure that no predator could again exploit the same blind spots. The success of these reforms is partial, for tragedies still occur, but the lessons of Houston remain embedded in the ongoing struggle to protect the vulnerable. For readers of Olsen's book, the impact is deeply personal. The narrative invites identification with families, with neighbors, with detectives, overwhelmed by the scale of discovery. It forces the reader to imagine what it would be like to search for a missing child, to plead with police, to wait for answers that never come. By placing the reader in these perspectives, Olsen ensures that the story resonates not as distant history, but as an intimate confrontation with loss. The book achieves what great true crime writing must. It transforms statistics into faces, headlines into human stories, horror into a call for empathy. As the decades stretched onward, anniversaries of Corll's death and of the discovery of the graves occasionally drew reflection. Local papers would run retrospective pieces reminding the public of the city's darkest chapter. Some younger readers were shocked to learn that such a massacre had once unfolded in their own city. Others used the retrospectives as opportunities to honor the victims anew, to insist that their names not be forgotten. In this sense, the case remains alive in memory, resurfacing whenever the need for vigilance or remembrance arises. The moral complexity of Henley's act of killing Corll also continues to provoke debate. Was it an act of desperate self-preservation, a sudden rupture of fear into violence? Was it a calculated decision to end a reign of terror? Was it both? The ambiguity ensures that Henley occupies a unique place in the history of crime, a participant who also became the executioner of the predator. This paradox fascinates scholars and storytellers alike, for it resists simple categorization. In him we see the collapse of victim and perpetrator into a single figure, a disturbing reminder that morality can fracture under manipulation. In the end, the story of the Candyman is not about Corll alone, but about the boys whose lives he stole, the families who bore the grief, the community that carried the scar, and the systems that failed them. It is about the need to remember, to confront, and to learn. Olsen's book endures because it captures all of these dimensions, transforming horror into testimony. Its pages ensure that the boys are not erased, that their lives are recorded, and that their deaths continue to speak. The Man with the Candy is therefore not only a true crime classic, but also a memorial, a warning, and a demand for empathy across time. The persistence of memory in cases like the Candyman murders often depends on the willingness of individuals to keep telling the story. For some families, the burden of remembrance is heavy but necessary. They attend parole hearings, speak to journalists, and cooperate with documentarians so that their sons' names will not vanish into archives. For others, silence is the chosen path, a way to preserve what little peace they can find. Both responses are understandable, both shaped by grief that never subsides. Olsen understood this duality and captured it in his reporting, offering space for both voices, the ones who speak and the ones who cannot. The texture of Houston itself has changed dramatically since the early 1970s, with booming growth, sprawling suburbs, and a modern skyline. New residents walk streets unaware of the horrors that once unfolded, yet the ghosts linger in the memories of older generations. Some houses where boys once lived are still standing, ordinary homes with new families who may never know the history. Other sites are gone, replaced by businesses or highways. This transformation of landscape illustrates how time erases physical traces but cannot erase the trauma carried in memory. In criminology classrooms across the country, the Candyman murders are still dissected. Students read case studies, analyze the failures, and discuss the psychology of predators and accomplices. They examine how grooming works, how systemic negligence magnifies danger, and how communities respond to trauma. The case provides a framework for understanding broader patterns in crime and justice. It serves as a grim textbook, its lessons written in the suffering of real children. For many students, encountering the story is shocking, a confrontation with the depths of cruelty possible in ordinary settings. It shapes their sense of responsibility as future law enforcement officers, social workers, or policymakers. The victims themselves remain young forever. Photographs frozen in time show them in school clothes, with long hair typical of the era, smiling in ways that belie their fate. These images are heartbreaking precisely because they are static, never aging, never progressing. Each boy is locked at the age of his disappearance, while the world moved on. Their peers grew up, built families, pursued careers, while they remained absent. This contrast is one of the cruelest dimensions of the case, a reminder that murder is not only the theft of life, but also the theft of future. Olsen's book emphasizes this by giving space to the family's reflections on what might have been, the milestones missed, the lives unlived. The narrative also underscores how easily trust can be weaponized. Corll offered candy, money, rides, friendship, the simple tokens of generosity that in normal contexts would be benign, but in his hands they became tools of manipulation. Brooks and Henley themselves were drawn in through such gestures, their loyalty purchased with gifts and attention. Once enmeshed, they became conduits for further predation, proof of how corruption spreads outward. This dynamic forces readers to confront the fragility of trust and the vigilance required to protect it. The moral reckoning of the case extends beyond the immediate players. Neighbors who had noticed oddities but said nothing carried regret. Teachers who dismissed absences as truancy wondered if they had overlooked danger. Police officers who filed reports as runaways lived with the knowledge that those dismissals may have cost lives. The collective guilt is diffuse but real, a reminder that evil flourishes not only because of the perpetrator's actions, but because of society's inaction. This lesson is sobering but vital. It compels communities to take responsibility for vigilance, to recognize that safety is a shared duty. In literary terms, The Man with the Candy endures because it fuses journalistic rigor with narrative power. Olsen does not embellish, but neither does he reduce the story to dry fact. His writing carries the rhythm of storytelling, pulling readers into the unfolding horror while maintaining fidelity to truth. He balances empathy with analysis, ensuring that the victims are honored even as the systemic failures are scrutinized. This balance sets the book apart from more sensational true crime accounts. It transforms it into a work that not only informs but also memorializes. For readers today, the book's impact lies in its universality. While the details are specific to Houston in the 1970s, the themes resonate everywhere. Vulnerable youth, manipulative predators, institutional blind spots, communal silence, these are not unique to one city or era. They are recurring risks that demand constant vigilance. The book becomes more than a chronicle of one killer. It becomes a mirror held up to society. Each reader must ask, would I have noticed? Would I have spoken? Would I have acted? The discomfort of those questions is part of the book's enduring power. Even as the decades pass, the Candyman murders remind us that evil rarely announces itself. It hides behind ordinary facades, behind kindness and gifts, behind the masks of neighbors and acquaintances. The case demands that we look beyond surface appearances and that we take seriously the cries of those who sense danger. In remembering the victims and reckoning with the failures, Olsen's book urges a vigilance rooted in empathy and responsibility. That is its lasting legacy, one that transcends the particularities of time and place. The passage of time did not lessen the horror of what had been uncovered in Houston, nor did it absolve the institutions that had failed the boys. Instead, the decades sharpened the sense that this case represented a turning point in how America thought about missing children. Before Corll's crimes were revealed, it was common for law enforcement to dismiss reports of vanished teenagers, particularly boys, as the natural rebellion of youth. Afterward, it became harder to justify such indifference. Though change came, slowly, the awareness that predators could use this assumption as cover began to shape policy. Families of victims spoke about how they had been brushed aside, and their testimonies became part of a national conversation about reform. By the 1980s, a cultural shift was underway. High-profile child abductions elsewhere in the country, such as the disappearance of Adam Walsh, combined with the memory of the Candyman murders to generate momentum for stronger protections. Hotlines were created, databases established, and campaigns launched to put the faces of missing children on milk cartons and television screens. While these initiatives had many origins, Houston's tragedy was part of the foundation. The boys, taken by Corll, were not only victims of one man but also of a society that failed to act. Remembering them meant demanding that no child be dismissed so easily again. In reflecting on the case, Olsen made clear that the line between victim and accomplice can blur in disturbing ways. Brooks and Henley embodied this tension. As teenagers, they were vulnerable to Corll's manipulation, yet as recruiters they were instruments of his cruelty. Their actions forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility. At what point does coercion become complicity? How should the law treat youths who participate in crimes under the influence of a predator? These questions remain unresolved, echoing in later cases where children were used by adults to commit atrocities. The ambiguity ensures that the Candyman story continues to challenge legal and moral frameworks. The imagery of the case also lingers in the imagination. The boat shed where many bodies were buried, the suburban houses with their drawn curtains, the torture board hidden in plain sight. All these details resonate because they are ordinary settings repurposed for horror. They dismantle the illusion that violence occurs only in dark alleys or distant battlefields. Instead, they remind us that it can thrive in the most mundane of places, shielded by familiarity. Olsen understood the symbolic weight of these images and presented them with stark clarity, letting readers feel the collision between normal life and hidden atrocity. The families, meanwhile, carried their grief into new decades. Some found solace in advocacy, others in faith, others in quiet remembrance. None found true closure because closure is a myth. The absence of their sons remained a wound that could not heal. They lived with anniversaries that marked not celebrations but losses, with birthdays that highlighted absence rather than presence. Olsen's portrayal of their grief is unsparing yet compassionate, reminding readers that the aftermath of murder extends far beyond the moment of death. It infiltrates every year that follows, shaping lives permanently. For the city of Houston, the case became part of its hidden history, seldom spoken of, but never entirely forgotten. Growth and prosperity did not erase the scar. Those who knew whispered it to newcomers, warning them of the darkness that once lurked in suburban streets. Teachers occasionally mentioned it in lessons about safety, journalists revisited it on anniversaries, and true crime writers mined it for insights. The case remains a reminder that beneath the image of any city lies layers of history, some celebratory, some horrific. Houston carries both, and the Candyman is one of the shadows it will never entirely escape. Olsen's achievement in The Man with the Candy lies in his refusal to let that shadow vanish. By documenting with precision and empathy, he created a permanent record that resists erasure. His book endures not just as a narrative of crime, but as a monument to the boys who were lost. It insists that their names be spoken, their stories told, their humanity recognized. This insistence is what elevates the work from journalism to literature, from reportage to testimony. It is why the book continues to be read decades later, long after many other true crime accounts have faded into obscurity. The resonance of the book also lies in its universality. While it tells a story rooted in a particular time and place, its themes of vulnerability, manipulation, institutional failure, and communal silence transcend context. Readers from different backgrounds recognize the risks in their own communities, the need for vigilance in their own lives. The book functions as both history and warning, ensuring that the legacy of the Candyman is not only horror, but also awareness. By the early 2000s, new generations of readers discovered Jack Olsen's work, often through reissued editions or digital formats that made the book more accessible. They approached the story not as distant history, but as a living cautionary tale, one that resonated in an era still struggling with missing children, trafficking, and exploitation. For many, the shock came not only from Corll's cruelty, but from the systemic blindness that allowed him to continue. Readers were struck by how familiar some of those failures sounded, even decades later. The lesson seemed clear. The danger is not only the predator, but also the complacency of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Parole hearings for Elmer Wayne. Henley became ritualized events, each one reigniting media attention and reopening wounds for the families. Reporters would note how much older Henley looked, how his youthful face had given way to grey hair and lines etched by time. Supporters argued that he had spent more years in prison than he had lived in freedom, that his role as the one who ended Corll's spree deserved recognition. Opponents reminded the public that he had lured his own friends to torture and death, that his complicity was active and sustained. The board inevitably sided with caution, denying parole again and again. Each denial was a relief to families, but also a reminder that the case would never truly be over as long as Henley was alive. David Brooks faded even further from public consciousness, his silence ensuring that he rarely appeared in headlines. Yet his role as Corll's first recruit remained important in understanding how predators build networks. Brooks was a case study in grooming, a teenager enticed by gifts, pulled into complicity, and ultimately trapped by dependency. His trajectory illustrates the vulnerability of adolescents and the predatory cunning of adults who exploit them. That he spent his life in prison is a testament to how early corruption can shape an entire destiny, turning a boy into an accomplice and erasing the possibility of an ordinary future. For Houston, the Candyman murders became part of its shadow history, rarely discussed openly but never absent from the city's memory. Some neighborhoods preserved the memory in whispers, parents telling their children about the danger that once lived next door. Others tried to bury it, preferring to focus on the city's growth and achievements. Yet anniversaries of the discovery of the bodies always brought it back to the surface. Newspapers published retrospectives, survivors gave interviews, and the story was retold for those too young to remember. The cycle of remembrance ensured that the victims were never entirely forgotten. The book itself continued to hold power because of Olsen's narrative choices. He avoided the temptation to mythologize Corll, refusing to grant him the allure that some killers acquire in popular culture. Instead, he framed him as an absence of empathy, a void of humanity. The focus remained squarely on the boys, on their families, on the community. This refusal to glorify evil is what keeps the book from aging badly. It reads not as sensationalism but as witness, not as exploitation but as testimony. In an era when true crime often risks entertainment value at the expense of dignity, Olsen's restraint is instructive. Psychologists who revisited the case often emphasize the importance of understanding grooming as a process, not a single event. Corll's manipulation of Brooks and Henley was gradual, systematic, and calculated. He provided rewards, created dependency, blurred moral lines, and escalated involvement step by step. By the time the boys realized what they were entangled in, they were too compromised to escape easily. This dynamic mirrors patterns seen in cults and abusive relationships, reinforcing the idea that complicity can emerge from coercion rather than pure choice. Yet the law must still grapple with accountability, for complicity results in harm regardless of cause. This tension remains one of the most enduring moral complexities of the case. The symbolic weight of the Candyman murders also influenced broader cultural narratives about safety. The phrase, stranger danger, which became widespread in the 1980s, drew strength from cases like Corll's. Parents taught children to be cautious of adults offering gifts, rides, or attention. Schools introduced programs emphasizing boundaries and caution. While these campaigns sometimes veered into paranoia, they were rooted in the legitimate fear created by predators like Corll. The legacy of Houston thus extended into national culture, shaping how generations of children were raised. Ultimately, the power of The Man with the Candy lies in its ability to make readers feel the weight of lost potential. Each victim was a boy with a future stolen, each family a community shattered. Olsen's detailed portraits transform them from faceless statistics into living presences, boys who laughed, dreamed, and loved before they were taken. By preserving their humanity, the book resists the erasure intended by the killer. It insists that we remember not only the horror, but the lives interrupted. That insistence is what makes the book endure as more than a crime story. It is a memorial carved in prose. By the second decade of the 21st century, the case was nearly half a century old, yet it still carried the power to disturb anyone who encountered it. Younger generations discovered the story through podcasts or online forums, often reacting with disbelief that such a massacre could be relatively unknown compared to other serial killer cases. Readers expressed outrage that Corll's name was not as infamous as Bundy or Gacy, arguing that the scale of his crimes warranted equal recognition. Others countered that notoriety was precisely what killers often craved, and that the quiet endurance of Olsen's book was a better memorial than sensational headlines. This debate reflected the ongoing tension in true crime culture between awareness and spectacle, between remembering victims and feeding fascination with predators. For families, the decades had not erased the loss. Many parents had passed away by then, but siblings and cousins carried the memory forward. They spoke of the absence at weddings, the empty spaces at family gatherings, the milestones that would never be reached. Some described how the murders shaped their own parenting, making them more protective, more cautious, sometimes to the point of overprotection. The legacy of trauma was intergenerational, shaping not only those who had lived through it but also those born long after. Olsen's decision to capture the voices of families ensured that this dimension of the story would not be forgotten, that readers would understand the depth of the wound. The case also continued to be used in professional training. Law enforcement academies cited it when teaching about the importance of missing person protocols. Social workers studied it as an example of how vulnerable youth can be groomed and exploited. Criminologists dissected the dynamics between Corll, Brooks, and Henley, exploring how manipulation creates complicity. Each discipline found in the story lessons that extended beyond its time and place. In this way, the tragedy became part of the collective knowledge aimed at preventing repetition. Henley's continued parole hearings kept the case alive in the news. Each hearing sparked articles that revisited the crimes, retold the story, and reignited debate. Some journalists interviewed him directly, publishing his reflections from prison. In those interviews, he sometimes expressed remorse, other times frustration at being defined forever by his teenage actions. Critics pointed out that his teenage actions involved delivering friends to torture and death, and that remorse seemed hollow when paired with self-defense. Supporters argued that he had grown old in prison, that he had paid with decades of his life, and that his act of killing Corll should be weighed more heavily. The board's denials were consistent, yet the very process ensured that the story remained unresolved. A wound reopened every few years. Brooks lived a quieter existence, rarely mentioned except in passing. His role as the first to be ensnared by Corll remained significant, but his silence kept him out of the spotlight. He exemplified the way some accomplices recede into the shadows, their presence still vital, but their voices absent. His life in prison was the echo of choices made under manipulation, choices that bound him forever to a legacy of horror. The city itself evolved, skyscrapers rising, new communities forming, old neighborhoods transformed. The physical sites of the murders disappeared into development, yet the memory endured in archives, in books, in the minds of those who lived through it. For some, the erasure of physical reminders was a blessing, allowing the city to move forward. For others, it was troubling, fearing that without visible markers the victims would be forgotten. Olsen's book remained the anchor, ensuring that forgetting was not possible. Readers who encountered the book for the first time often described an emotional journey. At first disbelief, then horror, then sorrow, and finally reflection. The narrative forced them to consider not only the evil of Corll, but the silence of society. They saw how easily indifference can kill, how crucial vigilance is, and how fragile trust can be. The book left them unsettled, which was precisely Olsen's intent. He did not want readers to close the book and move on unscathed. He wanted them to carry the weight, to recognize the cost of neglect, to remember the names of the boys. The endurance of the book, decades after publication, testifies to its power. Many true crime books fade quickly, their details consumed and forgotten. The Man with the Candy persists because it is not only a chronicle of crime, but also a meditation on responsibility. It forces readers to reckon with uncomfortable truths about society's failures, about the vulnerability of youth, and about the ordinariness of evil. This timeless relevance ensures that it will continue to be read, discussed, and taught, as long as the questions it raises remain unresolved. The story of Dean Corll endures because it forces us to confront the reality that evil is not always dramatic or visible, but can hide beneath the most ordinary exterior. He was a man who worked in a family candy business, who smiled politely at neighbors, who gave children sweets, and yet behind closed doors, he became one of the most prolific killers of children in American history. This contradiction unsettles us because it shatters the comforting belief that danger can be recognized easily. Olsen's book captures this tension perfectly, drawing the reader into the ordinariness of Corll's life before peeling back the mask to reveal the horror beneath. For criminologists, the Candyman murders remain a case study in the mechanics of grooming and complicity. Corll's recruitment of Brooks and Henley demonstrates how predators extend their reach by corrupting the vulnerable. The boys became both victims and perpetrators, their identities twisted by dependence and fear. This dynamic is not unique to Houston, but appears in many contexts where power is abused, from cults to gangs to trafficking networks. The The Candyman case provides a particularly stark example because the consequences were so extreme. It illustrates the danger of underestimating the power of manipulation, especially on adolescents searching for belonging. The victims' stories are the heart of Olsen's narrative, and they are what linger longest in the reader's memory. He describes their families, their hobbies, their small rebellions, their dreams. By humanizing them, he resists the erasure that serial killers often inflict. Corll tried to reduce them to objects of gratification and disposal, but Olsen restores them as sons, brothers, friends. This restoration is the greatest service the book performs. It ensures that readers remember not only the horror, but also the humanity. The long aftermath for the families is another theme that Olsen handles with care. He shows how grief does not end with the discovery of a body or the conclusion of a trial. It stretches across decades, shaping marriages, careers, health, and identities. Parents aged under the weight of sorrow. Siblings grew up haunted by absence. Communities adjusted their behavior, their trust forever damaged. These consequences remind us that murder is not a single event, but a continuing wound, rippling outward indefinitely. Henley's continued imprisonment into the 21st century became a symbol of unresolved tension. Each parole hearing was a reminder that the past was not past. Supporters argued that he had been manipulated, that his act of killing Corll proved his capacity for moral choice, that decades of incarceration had already exacted punishment. Opponents countered that his active recruitment of victims, his participation in murders, and the magnitude of the crimes warranted permanent imprisonment. The board consistently chose the latter view. But the debate itself illustrates how the case continues to resist easy answers. Brooks remained less visible, yet his life serves as a quiet testimony to the cost of corruption. He was not flamboyant, not a figure who sought attention, but his early entanglement with Corll defined his entire existence. His silence in later years perhaps reflects remorse, perhaps resignation, perhaps simply exhaustion. Whatever the cause, his story is a reminder that complicity, even passive, can destroy a life as surely as direct violence. As the decades accumulated, the Candyman murders became less a current event and more a historical case, yet the lessons remained fresh. Law enforcement continued to cite it as a turning point in how missing children are treated. Communities invoked it when discussing the importance of vigilance. True crime writers referenced it as one of the darkest episodes in American history. The case thus lives on not only in memory but in practice, shaping how we respond to danger and how we think about evil. Olsen's book ensures that this legacy is preserved. His writing style avoids sensationalism, focusing instead on fact, testimony, and empathy. He recognizes that the story's power lies not in dramatization, but in its plain truth. The horror is real, the grief authentic, the lessons undeniable. By presenting the story with restraint, he allows the reader to feel its weight without distortion. This is why the book endures while others fade. It is not merely a recounting of crimes, but a meditation on responsibility and humanity. For readers today, the experience of encountering the man with the candy is both harrowing and necessary. It confronts them with the fragility of trust, the danger of complacency, and the resilience of families who endure unimaginable loss. It asks them to remember, to empathize, and to remain vigilant. In this way, the book functions not only as a history of crime, but as a guide to conscience. Its endurance proves that some stories, however dark, must continue to be told, not to glorify evil, but to honor its victims and to warn the living. The narrative of the Candyman murders remains one of the clearest demonstrations of how a predator can thrive in the blind spots of a community. Dean Corll exploited not only the vulnerabilities of individual boys but also the weaknesses of institutions designed to protect them. Police dismissed disappearances as runaways, neighbors accepted oddities without question, and families were left without support when their children vanished. These failures formed the environment in which Corll operated, and Olsen's book makes it clear that without them, his spree could never have reached such a scale. The horror is not only in what one man did, but in how many opportunities were missed to stop him. For criminologists and sociologists, this case continues to serve as a cautionary tale. It illustrates the danger of assumptions, the importance of treating every disappearance as potentially serious, and the need for coordinated responses across agencies. It also demonstrates how predators often exploit the very trust and indifference that communities rely on. Corll's ability to present himself as polite, quiet, and harmless shielded him from suspicion. His use of Brooks and Henley as recruiters extended his reach and diverted attention. The lesson is sobering. Evil adapts to its environment, and vigilance must adapt in response. The boys who were lost remain the center of the story for those who loved them. Their absence shaped lives long after the graves were filled. Parents aged under grief, siblings grew up haunted, and communities carried scars. Olsen's decision to tell their stories individually ensures that they are remembered not as a number, but as sons with names, dreams, and laughter. This humanization is crucial because it resists the reduction of tragedy to statistic. Each boy mattered, and the book insists that readers remember them as individuals. The broader cultural impact of the case can be seen in how America came to view child safety. In the decades following the discovery of Corll's crimes, campaigns about stranger danger, missing children on milk cartons, and later the creation of national databases all reflected a growing awareness that children were not automatically safe in their neighborhoods. While these changes were influenced by many cases, the Candyman murders were among the most powerful catalysts. They demonstrated in horrific clarity what could happen when disappearances were ignored and predators were underestimated. Henley's continuing presence in prison became almost symbolic of unfinished business. Each time he sought parole, the story returned to headlines, a reminder that the past was never fully past. Families of victims relived their grief, advocates debated responsibility, and the public was confronted once more with the magnitude of the crimes. The board's denials were predictable, yet the ritual of the hearings kept the wounds raw. Henley himself aged visibly, his youthful defiance replaced by weariness, his words alternating between remorse and self-justification. He became a mirror for society's discomfort with the blurred line between victim and perpetrator, between child manipulated and child complicit. Brooks remained quieter, fading into the background of prison life. His silence spoke volumes, a reminder that complicity need not be flamboyant to be destructive. He was the first link in Corll's chain, the boy who became a recruiter, the teenager whose dependence on gifts led to entanglement in murder. His trajectory illustrates how corruption spreads, how one boy's manipulation can lead to the destruction of many others. The city of Houston, despite its growth and transformation, still carries the memory in its archives and in the hearts of those who remember. The physical sites are gone, but the story persists in documents, photographs, and testimonies. Journalists revisit it on anniversaries, true crime creators retell it for new audiences, and families continue to speak the names of their sons. The story endures because it must. Forgetting would be another form of erasure, another victory for the predator who tried to reduce the boys to nothing. Remembering restores their humanity and ensures that their loss has meaning beyond horror. Olsen's book achieves this restoration with precision and empathy. He constructs a narrative that is at once factual and emotional, detailed and reflective. He respects the victims, scrutinizes the failures, and refuses to glorify the killer. This balance makes the book timeless, relevant not only in the era of its publication, but for every generation that confronts the risks of vulnerability and the cost of indifference. It is why The Man with the Candy remains a cornerstone of true crime literature decades later, still read, still taught, still haunting. For modern readers, the story resonates because its themes remain urgent. Children are still vulnerable. Predators still exist. institutions still falter, and communities still hesitate to confront uncomfortable truths. The Candyman murders remind us that vigilance must be constant, empathy must be active, and accountability must be shared. They remind us that evil can look ordinary, that silence can be deadly, and that remembering is an act of justice. The book is not only history but a living warning, its relevance as enduring as the grief of the families who lost their sons. As the years turned into decades, the Candyman murders became less about Dean Corll himself and more about the boys whose lives he had taken and the society that had failed them. For the families, every anniversary was another reminder that time moved forward while their children remained frozen in photographs and memories. They never saw graduations, marriages, or grandchildren. They saw only absence. This permanence of loss is one of the most devastating truths that Olsen conveys. The reality that murder is not confined to the moment of death, but stretches across generations. In Houston, reminders of the case surfaced in unexpected ways. A newspaper feature would reintroduce the story to readers who had never heard of it. A parole hearing would push it back into headlines, with old photographs of Henley at 15 placed beside images of him middle-aged and greying. A community group would hold a vigil to honor the victims, lighting candles for names that had once been disregarded. Each resurfacing was painful but necessary, a way of insisting that forgetting was not an option. The psychology of Corll remained opaque because he never lived to face trial or interrogation. Speculation filled the vacuum. Some believed his cruelty was the result of sadistic compulsion. Others suggested deep-seated rage or repression. But in the end, there was no manifesto, no confession, no attempt to explain. Perhaps that is part of what makes the case so chilling, the absence of explanation, the sheer existence of cruelty without cause. Evil sometimes resists analysis, remaining simply as fact, and Olsen wisely avoids pretending that Corll can be neatly understood. He presents the acts, the patterns, the consequences, and lets readers confront the emptiness at the center. For Brooks and Henley, the trajectory of their lives in prison became long case studies in complicity and consequence. Brooks slipped into obscurity, his role remembered, but his voice seldom heard. Henley remained a lightning rod for debate. Some saw him as a boy manipulated into horror, others as a killer who deserved every year of his sentence. His act of killing Corll, which both ended the spree and revealed the crimes, complicated the narrative. Was it an act of courage or desperation, redemption or survival? The ambiguity kept the case alive in public memory, ensuring that it could never be resolved into a simple story of good and evil. The victims' families, meanwhile, bore the true weight. Some turned their grief into activism, pushing for reforms in how missing children were treated. Others withdrew into privacy, unwilling to relive their loss in public. But all carried the scars. Their testimonies, preserved in Olsen's narrative, ensure that readers understand the human cost of indifference. When police dismissed their pleas, when neighbors looked away, when institutions failed to act, their children paid the price. Remembering that failure is essential because it forces society to confront the consequences of silence. The Candyman murders also reshaped cultural understanding of safety. Before the 1970s, many parents assumed their children could wander neighborhoods freely, hitch rides, or accept gifts without danger. Afterward, suspicion became the default. Campaigns teaching children not to trust strangers gained traction, schools introduced safety programs, and communities became more guarded. While some lamented the loss of freedom, others recognized that vigilance was necessary. The case contributed to a cultural shift that still shapes parenting today, decades later. Olsen's book endures because it balances detail with empathy, horror with humanity. He reconstructs events meticulously, but he also gives space to grief, to memory, to reflection. He avoids sensationalism, refusing to turn Corll into a figure of fascination. Instead, he ensures that the focus remains on the boys, on the lives interrupted, on the cost to families and communities. This ethical stance makes the book not only powerful, but enduring. Readers finish it unsettled, saddened, and more aware, which is precisely the effect it was meant to have. The continuing relevance of the case lies in the universality of its lessons. Vulnerability, manipulation, institutional failure, and communal silence are not confined to one time or place. They recur whenever predators exploit weakness and society looks away. The Candyman murders remain a warning that the cost of indifference is measured in lives. They remind us that vigilance is not paranoia, but responsibility, that empathy is not optional, but essential. Olsen's book delivers that message with a clarity that has lasted for generations, and it will continue to resonate as long as societies grapple with how to protect their most vulnerable. With each passing decade, the case remained a touchstone for the dangers of complacency. Houston had transformed into a sprawling metropolis, yet the shadow of Corll lingered in quiet ways, in the memories of older residents and in the cautious parenting styles of those who had grown up under the spectre of his crimes. The name Candyman itself became shorthand for betrayal, a phrase that carried unease whenever it was spoken. Parents used it as a warning, true crime writers used it as a reference point, and police officers remembered it as an object lesson in what happens when disappearances are ignored. The boys' stories, though frozen in time, continued to matter. Photographs preserved their youth, their hairstyles and clothing forever tied to the 1970s, while their families aged without them. Siblings grew into adulthood carrying memories of laughter and play that abruptly ended. Some spoke about how their brother's absence shaped their own identities, making them more serious, more cautious, more determined never to take life for granted. Others described the way grief created silence in their homes, a heaviness that never lifted. Olsen's book captured these nuances, ensuring that readers did not see the victims as faceless numbers, but as children whose absence changed everything. Henley's parole hearings continued to spark debate. Each one was accompanied by renewed media coverage, reprints of photographs, and rehashing of details. Supporters framed him as someone who had been a manipulated teenager, pointing out that his act of killing Corll stopped the spree. Opponents reminded the public of the many boys he personally lured to their deaths, of the parents who had trusted him, of the betrayal that compounded the loss. The hearings became rituals of grief and resistance, occasions when families once again stood before officials and begged that justice not be undone. The repeated denials brought relief but also exhaustion, a reminder that the story would never truly close. Brooks remained less public, a shadow within the shadow. His silence was interpreted by some as remorse, by others as avoidance. His life in prison served as a quiet testimony to how early choices can shape an entire destiny. He was the boy who accepted gifts, who became entangled, who turned into an accomplice, and who lost any possibility of redemption. His story emphasizes the way predators expand their power by corrupting the vulnerable, creating accomplices who then spread the harm further. The cultural impact of the case was visible in the broader national conversation about missing children. By the 1980s and 1990s, campaigns like milk carton photos and later national databases had become commonplace. The Candyman murders were part of the reason. They demonstrated that children could vanish in clusters, that dismissing them as runaways could mask a predator's work, and that lives were at stake when institutions delayed action. The reforms that followed did not erase tragedy, but they created systems that might have prevented Corll from killing unchecked for so long. His crimes became part of the foundation upon which modern child protection efforts were built. For readers encountering Olsen's book decades later, the emotional impact remained strong. The narrative is relentless, pulling the reader deeper with each disappearance until the scale becomes overwhelming. By the time the bodies are discovered, the reader feels the weight of missed chances and silenced warnings. The horror lies not only in the killings but in the pattern of dismissal, the chorus of voices unheard. This aspect resonates across time, reminding readers that indifference is a form of complicity. The ordinariness of Corll is another reason the story endures. He was not flamboyant, not a figure who sought attention. He blended in, worked quietly, smiled politely. He embodied the unsettling truth that monsters do not always look monstrous. This reality is what makes the story continue to haunt, because it removes the comforting illusion that danger is obvious. Olsen underscores this theme by portraying Corll as an absence of empathy rather than a figure of fascination, leaving readers with the chilling recognition that evil can wear the most ordinary masks. Ultimately, the Candyman murders are remembered not because of Corll, but because of the boys. Olsen ensures that they remain the center, that their humanity is preserved, that their loss is not forgotten. His book is both history and memorial, both indictment and warning. It transforms horror into testimony, ensuring that the boys' voices, though silenced, still echo through the pages. The endurance of the book proves that some stories must be told again and again, not for the sake of the killer's notoriety, but for the sake of justice, empathy, and vigilance. The Candyman murders have become a story of haunting silence as much as of horror. Silence from the boys who never came home, silence from institutions that dismissed pleas, silence from neighbors who ignored oddities, silence that stretched into decades of grief. Olsen's book breaks that silence, forcing readers to listen, to remember, to confront. It is not only a chronicle of killings, but an indictment of indifference. The weight of that indictment gives the book its moral force and ensures its place in the canon of true crime literature. Houston itself has grown so much that entire neighborhoods, once central to the case, have been transformed beyond recognition. Streets have been renamed, houses demolished, new businesses constructed where bodies once lay hidden. For newcomers, the history is invisible, yet for those who remember it remains embedded in the landscape, an invisible layer beneath the city's prosperity. This duality is striking, the bustling metropolis above and the shadows of the past beneath. Olsen captures this tension in his narrative, showing how communities move forward while still carrying scars. The victims' families remain the most powerful voices in the story. Their testimonies convey grief that is raw even decades later, their refusal to forget ensuring that the boys' names continue to be spoken. Each time a family member stands at a parole hearing, each time they give an interview, they reaffirm that memory is a form of justice. The killer may be dead, the accomplice is imprisoned, but remembrance itself becomes resistance to erasure. Their persistence is a testament to love stronger than silence. The psychology of Corll remains an enigma because he left no explanation. We are left with fragments: his reputation for politeness, his gifts of candy, his recruitment of boys as accomplices, his hidden cruelty. Some argue that his crimes reflect pathology beyond comprehension, others that they reveal the dangers of unchecked sadism. But in the absence of confession or trial, Corll remains a void, a shadow defined only by the suffering he inflicted. Olsen wisely refuses to fill that void with speculation, allowing the emptiness itself to be chilling. Evil does not always come with reasons. Sometimes it comes only with consequences. Henley's continued presence in prison represents the unresolved questions that linger. He is at once victim and perpetrator, the boy manipulated into complicity and the man who lured friends to their deaths. His act of killing Corll ended the spree but did not erase the years of horror that preceded it. Each parole hearing replays this ambiguity, with families arguing against release and supporters advocating for mercy. The consistency of the board's denials reflects the gravity of his crimes, but the debate ensures that the case remains unsettled. That unsettledness is part of its legacy, a reminder that justice is not always neat. Brooks' obscurity is another element of the legacy. His silence leaves us with fewer insights into his role, but it also spares us the discomfort of hearing justification. He remains a symbol of how predators recruit and corrupt, how passive complicity can become deadly. His presence in the story reminds us that not all enablers are loud, Not all accomplices are visible, yet their impact can be just as destructive. The broader cultural impact of the case lies in how it reshaped perceptions of childhood safety. Before, children wandered freely, hitchhiked, trusted neighbors. After, caution became the norm. Stranger danger campaigns, school programs, and parental vigilance all drew strength from the memory of boys like those taken by Corll. Though some lamented the loss of freedom, others recognized it as necessary vigilance. In this way, the tragedy transformed into habit, woven into the way generations of parents raised their children. Readers of Olsen's book today often describe an emotional journey from disbelief to horror to sorrow to reflection. They come away changed, more cautious, more empathetic, more aware of the fragility of trust. The book is not entertainment but an experience, one that lingers long after the final page. Its power lies not only in its detail, but in its restraint, its refusal to sensationalize, its insistence on dignity. That restraint ensures its longevity, allowing it to speak across decades without losing relevance. In the end, The Man with the Candy endures because it is more than a story about a killer. It is a story about children whose lives were stolen, families whose grief is unending, communities whose trust was shattered, and a society forced to confront its failures. It is a book that insists on remembrance, that transforms horror into testimony, that demands vigilance. Its endurance proves that some stories must be told not for fascination, but for conscience, not for notoriety, but for justice. In remembering the boys, we resist the silence that predators depend upon. In telling their story, we affirm that their lives mattered. As the murders settled into the history of Houston and the history of American crime, their meaning continued to evolve. For some, the case was a reminder of the vulnerability of adolescence. For others, a lesson in the failures of institutions. And for still others, a meditation on the nature of evil. Olsen's book captures all of these dimensions, weaving them together into a narrative that is as much about society as about one man. By situating Corll's cruelty within the context of communal indifference, Olsen ensures that the story transcends the particulars of time and place. It becomes a warning relevant wherever children are dismissed, wherever predators exploit silence. The family's grief is the through line that keeps the narrative grounded. Their testimonies reveal the daily cost of loss, the way absence infiltrates every corner of life. A mother setting the table and stopping short at the empty chair. A father unable to walk past his son's old room without feeling a weight in his chest. A sibling who dreams of the brother who never returned. These images carry more power than statistics ever could. They remind us that crime is not only measured in numbers but in the endless ripples of human sorrow. Henley's parole hearings, continuing decade after decade, became rituals of remembrance. Each time families gathered to oppose release, they reasserted the memory of their sons. The hearings forced the public to look back, to remember the details, to reckon with the horror once again. Henley himself aged, his youthful defiance replaced by weariness, his words a mixture of remorse and justification. Supporters saw in him the possibility of redemption. Opponents saw only betrayal too deep to forgive. The parole board's repeated denials kept him confined, but the process itself ensured that the story never faded completely from public consciousness. Brooks's life behind bars faded into obscurity, but his silence remained part of the legacy. He exemplified the quiet enabler, the accomplice who did not seek attention, but whose actions nonetheless made horror possible. His trajectory illustrates the long reach of manipulation, how one boy's corruption can lead to countless deaths. His story is less discussed but no less essential, a reminder that complicity can take many forms. The city of Houston moved forward, but its history carried the weight of what had been revealed. Development covered the physical sites, new communities formed, and the skyline rose, but beneath the surface the memory remained. For those who had lived through it, the story was never far away. Some spoke of it openly, others avoided the subject, but all carried it in some form. The case became part of the city's shadow history, a chapter that shaped its identity even as it was seldom acknowledged publicly. The broader cultural impact of the case is seen in the way American society redefined childhood safety. The trust of earlier decades gave way to caution, the freedom of wandering neighborhoods replaced by rules and vigilance. Stranger danger campaigns, missing children posters, and eventually national databases all bore the imprint of lessons learned from cases like Corll's. While no system can prevent all tragedy, these measures reduce the chances of another predator operating unchecked for years. The Candyman murders thus contributed in their terrible way to the protection of future generations. Readers of The Man with the Candy often describe the experience as transformative. The book does not allow them to remain detached. Its detail, its empathy, its refusal to sensationalize force the reader to engage deeply. They come away with a heightened sense of vigilance, a stronger empathy for victims, and a recognition of the importance of listening when families cry out for help. The book achieves what great nonfiction should. It informs, it unsettles, and it changes how readers see the world. In the end, the story of Dean Corll is not about him, but about the boys he destroyed, the families who grieved, the city that bore the scar, and the society that must learn. Olsen's achievement is to capture all of this with precision and compassion, transforming horror into testimony. The book endures because it insists that we remember, not for fascination, but for conscience, not for notoriety, but for justice. It is a story that must continue to be told, not to honor the killer, but to honor the lives that were stolen and to remind us all of the cost of silence. The passing of time has a way of softening memory, but in the case of the Candyman murders, the edges remain sharp. The sheer scale of the crimes and the youth of the victims prevent them from fading into abstraction. Each boy was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Their absence created voids that no amount of time could fill. Olsen's book ensures that these voids are seen and felt, that readers cannot slip into the complacency of forgetting. The story is not framed as past alone, but as an ongoing presence, a reminder that grief has no expiration date. Houston itself has grown into one of the largest cities in the nation, a hub of commerce and culture, its modern skyline a symbol of progress. Yet beneath the prosperity lies a hidden layer of history, a chapter that reshaped how its citizens thought about safety and trust. For those who remember, the memory surfaces in small ways, in cautious glances at neighbors, in conversations with children about caution, in anniversaries marked by quiet sorrow. The city's identity includes triumphs and tragedies, and the Candyman murders remain one of the darkest threads in its fabric. The survivors of the families became living memorials to the boys. Some carried photographs in wallets for decades, some kept bedrooms untouched as shrines, some spoke to journalists whenever the case resurfaced. Their persistence is an act of defiance against erasure. They remind us that the cost of indifference is not just statistical but personal, measured in birthdays missed, in laughter silenced, in futures stolen. Olsen's attention to these details ensures that the book is more than reportage. It is a testament to love enduring even in the face of horror. Henley's parole hearings by now had become almost ritualistic. Each denial was expected, but each hearing still forced families to testify, to reopen wounds, to relive the details. For Henley himself, the hearings were a chance to argue for redemption, to present himself as changed, as someone who had paid with decades of his life. His words often blended remorse with justification, a mixture that convinced few beyond his small circle of supporters. The board's denials reaffirmed society's judgment, yet the process ensured that the story remained alive, a wound that could not close because it was reopened repeatedly. Brooks, quieter and less visible, embodied another form of consequence. His life was a study in how one decision can ripple outward endlessly. The gifts he accepted, the loyalty he offered to Corll, the silence he kept, these actions sealed his fate. His obscurity in later years may have been his own choice, or it may have been society's indifference, but either way, his presence in the narrative is unavoidable. He is proof of how predators corrupt not only their direct victims, but also those they draw into complicity. His life, wasted in confinement, is a shadowy testament to that corruption. The broader cultural meaning of the case lies in how it reshaped national attitudes toward childhood vulnerability. The idea that children could vanish in clusters without immediate action became intolerable after Houston. Campaigns for missing children, public service announcements, and the creation of national organizations all drew energy from the recognition that predators thrive in neglect. The Candyman murders were among the tragedies that forced America to confront the reality that safety could not be assumed. They turned grief into policy, horror into vigilance. Readers continue to find Olsen's book harrowing but necessary. They describe sleepless nights after reading, haunted by the images of boys lost and families broken. Yet they also describe gratitude for the honesty, for the refusal to look away, for the insistence on memory. The book changes how they view their communities, their institutions, their responsibilities. It does what lasting literature should. It shapes perception, it deepens empathy, it challenges complacency. In the end, the Candyman story is not about sensationalism, but about remembrance. It is about ensuring that the boys' names are not lost, that the family's grief is not ignored, that the lessons are not forgotten. Olsen's book stands as a monument in prose, a structure of memory that resists the erosion of time. Its endurance proves that some stories must be retold not to glorify evil, but to guard against it, not to fascinate, but to awaken. The Candyman murders remain one of the darkest chapters in American history, and The Man with the Candy ensures that we carry its lessons forward. The Candyman murders occupy a paradoxical place in American memory. They are among the deadliest serial killings in the country's history, yet they are not as widely known as cases with fewer victims. This paradox says as much about media and culture as it does about crime. Killers like Bundy or Dahmer became infamous partly because they courted notoriety, left behind interviews, or were pursued in dramatic manhunts. Corll, in contrast, left almost nothing. He was killed suddenly, his crimes exposed all at once, his face quickly forgotten outside of Houston. In a strange way, this obscurity is a mercy, for it denies him the celebrity that others acquired. Yet it also risks minimizing the memory of the boys, whose suffering deserves as much recognition as any other victims in history. Olsen's book bridges this paradox, preserving the story with dignity, even as popular culture largely looked elsewhere. The absence of Corll's own voice in the record means that we are left with silence where explanation might have been. Some find this unsatisfying, yearning to understand motive, to extract meaning from atrocity. But others recognize that no explanation could ever suffice. To try to rationalize his cruelty is to risk normalizing it. Olsen's restraint here is powerful. By presenting the facts without attempting to psychoanalyze, he forces readers to confront the stark reality of evil without the comfort of reason. It is a reminder that not all horrors can be explained. Some can only be acknowledged. Henley's ongoing imprisonment embodies the unresolved complexity of the case. He is both the boy manipulated and the man complicit, both the one who lured friends to death and the one who killed the predator. His act of rebellion stopped the murders but did not erase the lives already taken. Each parole hearing becomes a stage where this duality is debated. Families remind the board of the depth of betrayal, while supporters emphasize his youth and his eventual act of defiance. The denials reaffirm society's refusal to forgive, yet the cycle of hearings ensures that the story is never truly put to rest. Brooks represents a different lesson, quieter but no less significant. His life in prison, marked by obscurity, reflects how corruption can trap someone permanently. He was the first link in Corll's chain, the teenager who accepted gifts and then delivered others. His story reminds us that complicity often begins with small decisions, seemingly harmless acts that accumulate into irreversible consequences. His silence in later years may be interpreted as remorse or simply resignation, but either way, it is a form of testimony, a life wasted in the shadow of another man's cruelty. For the families of victims, remembrance has been their form of justice. Some participated in vigils, others spoke to reporters, others simply carried memory privately, but all refused to let their sons be forgotten. Their voices in Olsen's book are what give it its deepest power. They are not passive observers of history, but active guardians of memory, insisting that the boys' lives be honored even as their deaths are recounted. Their persistence is a rebuke to indifference, a declaration that love endures beyond horror. The cultural legacy of the case can be traced in the way America changed its view of missing children. No longer could disappearances be dismissed casually. The reforms that followed, databases, hotlines, public campaigns, were shaped in part by the recognition that predators exploit precisely such dismissals. The Candyman murders helped to transform a culture of neglect into one of vigilance, though the change came at a terrible cost. Every missing child poster, every Amber Alert, carries within it the memory of tragedies like Houston's, reminders of what happens when warnings are ignored. Readers encountering the man with the candy decades after its publication still describe it as shattering. The detail, the empathy, the unflinching honesty leave them changed. It is not a book one forgets quickly. Instead, it lingers, shaping how readers view trust, institutions, and community responsibility. That lingering effect is Olsen's achievement, his way of ensuring that the boys live on, not only in memory, but in the caution and empathy of those who learn their story. In the end, the Candyman murders are less about Corll than about what society must confront in itself. The ease with which disappearances were ignored, the reluctance of neighbors to question, the failures of institutions, these are the elements that allowed horror to flourish. Olsen's book forces readers to face these truths, to recognize that safety is fragile and responsibility collective. It is this broader lesson that makes the book endure, transforming it from a chronicle of one killer into a meditation on vigilance and empathy. The story of the Candyman murders reveals not only the cruelty of one man, but also the resilience of those who survived him. Families who lost children carried unbearable grief, yet found ways to endure, to remember, and in some cases to advocate for change. Their persistence ensured that the victims were not erased, that the lessons were not forgotten. Olsen's book gives them voice, allowing their love and their sorrow to resonate through time. In this way, the narrative becomes not only about horror, but also about endurance, a testament to the strength of memory. Houston itself embodies this duality. On the surface, it grew into a thriving metropolis, its skyline a symbol of prosperity and progress. Beneath that surface, however, lingers the scar of what was uncovered in the 1970s. The physical sites have been erased, built over or demolished, yet the memory remains embedded in the city's identity. For long-time residents, the story is never far away, whispered in warnings to children, recalled in anniversaries, resurfaced in news features. The city lives with both pride and shadow, both growth and grief. Henley's story remains one of the most complicated aspects of the case. As he aged in prison, his image transformed, from teenage accomplice to middle-aged prisoner to an older man facing the twilight of his life behind bars. Each stage brought new debates about responsibility and redemption. Supporters continued to argue that he was a child manipulated into complicity, that his act of killing Corll saved lives. Opponents reminded the world that he had delivered boys into torture, that his betrayal had multiplied the grief of families. The truth, as always, lies in the tension between these perspectives, a tension that ensures the case remains unsettled. Books, quieter and less visible, serves as a reminder that complicity can take many forms. His silence in later years denied us the clarity of reflection, but it also denied Corll the notoriety that often clings to accomplices who speak too freely. His life in prison, spent largely in obscurity, stands as a testament to how a boy's corruption can consume an entire existence. His role, though less debated than Henley's, is no less significant. Without him, Corll's reach would have been diminished. His presence in the narrative is essential, even if his voice remains absent. The boys who were lost are the heart of everything. Olsen ensures that readers meet them not as names on a list, but as children with dreams, families, and laughter. Each story is a reminder of what was taken, the potential futures erased, the joys denied, the families broken. Their absence reverberates across decades, shaping not only their families, but also the broader society that must reckon with the cost of neglect. By centering the victims, Olsen refuses to let the killer dominate the story. The book becomes a memorial in prose, preserving lives that otherwise might have been overshadowed. The cultural shifts that followed in the United States can be traced back to cases like Corll's. Missing child protocols, national databases, public campaigns, all were influenced by the recognition that predators thrive when institutions fail. The Candyman murders became part of the foundation for reforms that reshaped how America views child safety. Though these reforms came too late for the boys of Houston, they represent a form of justice for future generations. The tragedy was not in vain if it prevented other families from enduring the same fate. Readers of The Man with the Candy often describe it as transformative. They come away with a heightened sense of vigilance, a deeper empathy for victims, and a recognition of the fragility of trust. The book unsettles them, lingers with them, changes how they see their communities. This is Olsen's achievement, to write a book that is not only informative, but also morally urgent. His refusal to sensationalize, his insistence on empathy, and his attention to detail ensure that the story endures as both literature and testimony. Ultimately, the Candyman murders are a story of vulnerability exploited, of silence weaponized, of grief endured. They remind us that evil thrives when warnings are ignored, and that justice depends on remembrance. Olsen's book captures these truths with clarity and compassion, ensuring that the boys are not forgotten and that the lessons are not lost. It endures because it must, because some stories are too important to fade, because the cost of forgetting is measured in lives. The passage of nearly half a century has not dulled the relevance of the Candyman murders. Each new generation that encounters the story reacts with shock, disbelief, and anger. Shock at the scale of the killings, disbelief that they could go unnoticed for so long, and anger that the institutions meant to protect children dismissed the pleas of desperate families. These emotions are not just historical responses, but contemporary ones, proof that the lessons of Houston still resonate. Olsen's book is the bridge that carries those lessons forward, ensuring that the tragedy remains alive in memory and conscience. The absence of Corll's own voice is both frustrating and clarifying. Because he died before trial, we are left without confession, without courtroom testimony, without psychological evaluation. What remains are the fragments, the testimony of Brooks and Henley, the evidence recovered from his homes, the stories of victims' families. This absence denies us the false comfort of motive. It forces us to confront evil as it is, without explanation, without justification. Olsen's choice not to speculate recklessly respects this absence. He allows the void itself to be chilling, reminding readers that some acts cannot be explained, only remembered. Henley's decades in prison have turned him into a strange figure in the narrative, both notorious and forgotten. Each parole hearing drags him back into the light, only to see him returned again to obscurity after denial. His own words, when he chooses to give them, reveal a man who struggles to reconcile his youth with his actions, who alternates between remorse and defensiveness. For families of the victims, his voice is unbearable, a reminder of betrayal that cannot be undone. For criminologists, he is a case study in the complexity of complicity. For society, he is a reminder that justice is rarely simple, that guilt and victimhood can coexist uneasily. Brooks remains a quieter presence, his life shaped entirely by the choices he made as a teenager under Corll's influence. His obscurity is a kind of punishment, a life spent in shadows defined by absence rather than notoriety. He reminds us that not all accomplices become infamous, but all are marked forever. His story underscores the way predators extend their reach by corrupting others, turning victims into instruments, spreading destruction outward like ripples in water. For the families, the decades have not brought closure, because closure is impossible. They have found ways to endure, to live, to remember, but the absence of their children is permanent. Their testimonies in Olsen's book reveal the weight of that absence in daily life, in rituals, in anniversaries. They speak of the empty spaces at the table, the birthdays uncelebrated, the milestones missed. Their grief is not past, but present, woven into the fabric of their lives. By including their voices, Olsen ensures that the narrative does not drift into abstraction. It remains grounded in human sorrow. The broader society has absorbed the lessons in subtle but lasting ways. Parents teach children to be cautious, communities respond more urgently to disappearances, institutions maintain protocols that were unthinkable before. The Candyman murders helped to build this vigilance, though at a terrible cost. Each Amber Alert, each database of missing children, each campaign reminding the public to pay attention carries within it the shadow of tragedies like Houston's. The reforms are not perfect, but they represent progress carved out of pain. Readers encountering the book today still describe it as overwhelming. The relentlessness of the narrative, the accumulation of disappearances, the haunting aftermath, it leaves them unsettled in a way that lingers. Olsen's restraint, his refusal to sensationalize, enhances the impact. The horror emerges not from graphic detail, but from the quiet accumulation of fact. By the end, the reader feels the weight of grief and the necessity of vigilance. The book accomplishes what it set out to do, to honor the victims, to indict indifference, to warn the living. In the end, the Candyman murders are remembered not because of Corll, but because of the boys. They are the reason the story endures, the reason the book matters, the reason we continue to reflect decades later. Olsen's achievement is to restore their humanity, to give them presence in memory, to transform them from statistics into sons whose absence reshaped lives. His book is both history and memorial, a text that insists on remembrance. It is a work that ensures the lessons of Houston are carried forward, that the silence is broken, that the boys are not forgotten. The Candyman murders remain singular not only for their scale, but for the way they reveal the fragility of trust. Dean Corll cultivated the image of a neighbor who handed out sweets, who offered rides, who seemed harmless. This very ordinariness was his disguise, the mask that allowed him to move freely and recruit boys without suspicion. It is unsettling because it dismantles the illusion that danger can always be recognized. Olsen captures this with precision, showing how Corll's greatest weapon was not force alone, but trust corrupted into betrayal. The role of Brooks and Henley underscores this point even more. By using teenagers to lure victims, Corll exploited the natural trust that children place in peers. Few boys would have followed a quiet, middle-aged man into danger, but they followed their friends, unaware of the trap. This method amplified the betrayal, turning bonds of friendship into instruments of death. It also complicated the narrative forever, forcing us to grapple with the blurred lines between victimhood and complicity. Brooks and Henley were children corrupted, yet they were also participants in cruelty. This tension makes the case difficult to resolve morally, and Olsen wisely leaves that tension intact. The families of victims carried this betrayal as a unique form of grief. They did not only lose their sons, they learned that those sons had been delivered into horror by boys they trusted. The layers of betrayal deepened the wound, compounding sorrow with disbelief. Olsen records these voices with compassion, ensuring that readers feel not only the horror of the crimes, but the complexity of the loss. It is not a simple story of predator and prey, but of manipulation, betrayal, silence, and grief intertwined. Henley's later life in prison illustrates how this complexity persists across decades. His parole hearings replay the debates endlessly, forcing society to revisit the question of how to judge a boy manipulated into atrocity. His act of killing Corll ended the spree, but his years of complicity made him part of it. The board's repeated denials reflect the enormity of the crimes, but the very fact that hearings continue shows how unsettled the case remains. Families relive their pain, the public rehashes the details, and Henley becomes the embodiment of ambiguity, a killer and a rescuer, a victim and a perpetrator. Brooks, fading into obscurity, represents another form of aftermath. His silence means fewer debates, fewer headlines, but it also denies closure. He lives out his sentence as a reminder that some stories do not end dramatically, but quietly, with lives wasted in shadows. His trajectory is perhaps the most tragic in its simplicity. A boy corrupted into complicity, an adult life consumed by imprisonment, a future erased by a predator's manipulation. The victims remain the core of the story. Their photographs, their hobbies, their families' memories bring them back into focus, refusing to let them be reduced to statistics. Olsen insists that readers know them, see them, remember them. This humanization is what elevates the book from reportage to memorial. It ensures that the boys live on in memory, that their laughter and dreams are preserved alongside the horror of their deaths. It is the most important achievement of the book and the reason it endures. The cultural shifts that followed were profound. Parents became more vigilant, institutions created protocols, communities grew cautious. The idea that children could vanish without immediate investigation became unacceptable. The Candyman murders were part of the foundation of this shift, a tragedy that forced change. Though reforms cannot undo the past, they represent a form of justice for the future, protecting children who might otherwise have been lost. Readers of The Man with the Candy continue to describe it as haunting. It does not read as entertainment, but as reckoning. It compels them to confront uncomfortable truths, to recognize the cost of silence, to question their own communities. The power of the book lies not in sensational detail, but in the weight of fact, in the empathy for victims, in the indictment of indifference. It leaves readers changed, more aware, more cautious, more determined to listen when warnings are sounded. Ultimately, the legacy of the Candyman murders is not only horror, but also warning. It is a reminder that vigilance is essential, that silence is deadly, that evil can hide behind the most ordinary masks. Olsen's book ensures that this warning is carried forward, that the boys are remembered, that the lessons are not lost. It transforms tragedy into testimony, making memory itself a form of justice. The Candyman murders also highlight how communities struggle with denial. Neighbors noticed strange patterns but chose not to act. Police heard desperate pleas from parents but dismissed them as exaggerations. And society at large assumed that boys who disappeared had simply run away. This collective reluctance to see what was in front of them gave Corll space to operate. Olsen underscores this, not to assign blame carelessly, but to show how indifference and denial can be as deadly as cruelty itself. The tragedy forces us to ask how many dangers we ignore in our own time, what warnings we dismiss, what silences we allow to persist. The figure of Corll himself remains unsettling because he is not the typical monster of popular imagination. He was not flamboyant, did not seek fame, did not even leave behind a narrative of his own. He moved quietly, blending into his surroundings, cultivating an image of politeness. That ordinariness is perhaps the most frightening aspect because it removes the comfort of thinking that evil always looks obvious. Olsen presents him not as a complex character to be analyzed, but as an absence of empathy, a void defined only by harm. The refusal to glorify him is part of what makes the book endure. Brooks and Henley illustrate how predators extend their power by corrupting others. They were boys who might otherwise have lived ordinary lives, but under Corll's influence they became instruments of horror. Their stories complicate the narrative, forcing readers to wrestle with the blurred line between manipulation and responsibility. Brooks's silence and Henley's parole hearings offer two different versions of aftermath, one obscure, one public, but both are shaped by the corruption of adolescence. The tragedy of their lives reinforces the lesson that predators do not only destroy their direct victims, but also those they ensnare into complicity. The victims remain the heart of the story, and their absence is the wound that will not close. Families describe birthdays that became days of mourning, graduations that never happened, weddings that would never come. Their grief is intergenerational, carried by siblings, cousins, even the children of those who were left behind. Olsen's decision to present their lives in detail ensures that readers see them as more than names. They become boys we can imagine knowing, boys we can imagine being. Their humanity is preserved, which is the greatest form of justice literature can offer. Henley's continued imprisonment illustrates society's refusal to resolve ambiguity too quickly. Each hearing is an echo of the original debates, a ritualized return to the question of whether redemption is possible in the shadow of atrocity. Families speak, supporters argue, journalists report, and then the decision comes: denial, confinement, continuation of the cycle. The process is exhausting for all involved, but ensures that the story remains alive, that the victims' names are spoken again and again. The cultural shifts that followed the murders continue to shape America. Amber Alerts, missing children databases, school safety programs, all of these carry the imprint of tragedies like Houston's. They are reminders that vigilance was purchased at a terrible price, that reforms came only after unbearable loss. In this sense, the boys' deaths contributed to the protection of children who came after, though the justice of such a trade will always feel incomplete. Readers who pick up The Man with the Candy decades later often find themselves haunted by its restraint. It does not scream or sensationalize. It simply presents the facts, lets the voices of families be heard, and allows the horror to emerge naturally. This approach makes the book timeless. It is not tied to the sensationalism of its era, but stands as a document of empathy and indictment. Its power lies in its quiet insistence that we look, that we listen, that we remember. In the end, the Candyman murders are not just a chapter in Houston's history, but a mirror for society. They show what happens when warnings are ignored, when children are dismissed, when communities choose silence. Olsen's achievement is to turn that mirror toward us, forcing us to confront not only Corll's cruelty but our own responsibilities. The book endures because it demands vigilance, empathy, and remembrance. It ensures that the boys are not lost to time, that their lives continue to matter, that their absence continues to speak. The Candyman murders remain one of the darkest reminders that evil does not always arrive with warning signs. Corll lived in plain sight, working quietly, maintaining a mask of ordinariness. His ability to operate for years without drawing suspicion forces us to confront the unsettling truth that danger can be invisible until it is too late. Olsen captures this without embellishment, showing how trust itself became the instrument of betrayal. That betrayal is what makes the story resonate so powerfully, because it dismantles the illusion that safety can ever be assumed. For Brooks and Henley, the trajectory of their lives reflects the devastating impact of manipulation. They were boys when they entered Corll's orbit, drawn by gifts, by promises, by the need for belonging. Over time, they became accomplices, luring friends into danger, participating in crimes that would define them forever. Their lives in prison illustrate how predators destroy not only their direct victims, but also those they corrupt. Brooks's silence and Henley's parole hearings present two different forms of aftermath, but both are shaped by the loss of potential and the burden of guilt. Their stories are cautionary tales about how easily vulnerability can be exploited. The families of the victims endured grief that outlasted decades. Olsen ensures that their voices remain central, presenting them not as background figures, but as the heart of the narrative. They remind readers that each victim was a child with dreams, with laughter, with a future. Their grief is measured not in numbers, but in the endless absence of milestones, birthdays uncelebrated, graduations unseen, weddings that never came. This unending sorrow is the truest measure of Corll's cruelty, and it is what gives the book its moral weight. Henley's continued imprisonment serves as a reminder of ambiguity that cannot be resolved. Each parole hearing replays the same arguments: that he was manipulated, that he acted in defiance when he killed Corll, that he has paid with decades of his life, that he betrayed friends, that he lured them knowingly, that his complicity was active and devastating. The board's repeated denials show society's unwillingness to grant forgiveness, yet the hearings themselves ensure that the debate never ends. In this way, the story refuses closure, remaining alive in public consciousness. Brooks, meanwhile, embodies another form of consequence: obscurity. His name surfaces rarely, his voice almost never. He becomes a reminder that complicity does not always end with notoriety. Sometimes it ends with silence, with a life wasted in shadows, with no redemption and no attention. His story shows how predators spread destruction outward, corrupting those around them and leaving trails of broken lives even beyond their direct victims. The broader cultural shifts that followed are part of the murder's legacy. The creation of missing children databases, the spread of Amber Alerts, the introduction of safety programs in schools, all of these reforms trace their roots to tragedies like Houston's. They are imperfect, but they represent progress carved out of loss. The Candyman murders forced America to confront the reality that children cannot be dismissed as runaways, that every disappearance must be taken seriously. That recognition has saved lives, even if it came too late for the boys of Houston. Readers of The Man with the Candy often describe the experience as transformative. The book unsettles them, lingers with them, changes how they view their communities. Olsen's refusal to sensationalize, his empathy for victims, his focus on detail rather than drama make the book timeless. It is not an easy read, but it is a necessary one. It compels readers to reckon with uncomfortable truths, to recognize the cost of indifference, to carry forward the lessons of vigilance and empathy. In the end, the Candyman murders endure in memory because they demand remembrance. They are not only a story of one man's cruelty, but of families' grief, of communities' silence, of institutions' failures. Olsen's achievement is to transform this tragedy into testimony, to preserve the voices of victims and families, to insist that the lessons not be lost. His book is both memorial and warning, a reminder that safety is fragile, that vigilance is essential, that empathy is justice. It endures because it must, because the cost of forgetting would be measured in more lives. The Candyman murders also expose how institutions often fail when their frameworks are outdated or when prejudice shapes perception. In the 1970s, the assumption that missing boys were runaways was pervasive. Police officers dismissed distraught parents, filing minimal reports, and assuring families that their children would return on their own. This assumption was deadly. It gave Corll the time and freedom to continue killing, turning silence into cover. Olsen emphasizes this failure because it is central to the story. The crimes were not invisible, but the warnings were ignored. This indifference is as much a villain in the book as Corll himself. The victims' families carried the scars of that indifference for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of feeling not only grief, but betrayal. Betrayal by the authorities who should have protected them, by the neighbors who looked away, by the systems that discounted their pleas. This layered pain is what made their persistence so remarkable. Even decades later they continued to speak, to oppose parole, to ensure their children's names were not lost. Their voices became the conscience of the narrative, reminding us that the cost of neglect is not abstract but human, borne by those left behind. Henley's continued presence in prison turned him into a kind of living echo of the crimes. Each time his parole hearing appeared on the calendar, the past resurfaced. Families prepared statements, journalists revisited the story, and the old wounds were reopened. Henley himself seemed at times weary, at other times defiant, his words a mixture of regret and self-defense. For some, his life sentence represented justice. For others, it represented the unresolved complexity of a boy who was both victim and perpetrator. That tension ensures that the story remains unsettled, a reminder that some crimes resist neat resolution. Brooks, by contrast, remained almost invisible in the public eye. His life sentence was lived in obscurity, without the recurring spotlight of parole hearings. Yet his role is no less significant. He was the first to be corrupted, the teenager whose compliance gave Corll his opening. His silence in later years denies us the opportunity to understand his perspective, but it also denies Corll the spectacle of accomplices defending themselves. Brooks' obscurity is its own kind of testimony, a life erased by early choices, a future consumed by complicity. The victims remain the core of the story. Their faces in photographs, their hobbies, their laughter described by families, these details give the book its heart. Olsen insists that readers know them, that they are remembered as more than a list of names. Their humanity is what elevates the book beyond crime reporting. It transforms it into a memorial, a record of lives stolen and families broken. By centering the boys, Olsen resists the erasure intended by Corll, ensuring that their presence endures even in absence. The cultural impact of the murders is visible in the reforms that followed. Missing children campaigns, public service announcements, and new police protocols all grew out of the recognition that predators thrive in neglect. The Candyman murders helped change a culture that once dismissed disappearances into one that responds with urgency. The cost of that transformation was unbearable, but the result has been lives saved in the decades since. In this way, the boys' deaths shaped the future. Their absence turned into vigilance for others. Readers who approach the book today describe it as relentless. It does not let them escape into detachment. Each disappearance, each ignored warning, each grieving family pulls them deeper into sorrow and outrage. By the end, they are left with a sense of responsibility, a recognition that silence is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that empathy must be active. Olsen's restraint amplifies this effect. He avoids sensationalism, letting the facts speak for themselves. And the result is a narrative that lingers far beyond its final page. Ultimately, the Candyman murders endure not because of Corll, but because of the boys and the lessons their loss forces us to learn. They remind us that evil thrives in indifference, that communities must listen to those who cry for help, that predators exploit silence as much as trust. Olsen's book captures these truths with clarity and compassion, ensuring that the boys are remembered and that the warning is carried forward. It is both memorial and indictment, both history and conscience, both grief and warning. It endures because it has to, because the cost of forgetting would be measured in new tragedies. The Candyman murders also expose how institutions often fail when their frameworks are outdated or when prejudice shapes perception. In the 1970s, the assumption that missing boys were runaways was pervasive. Police officers dismissed distraught parents, filing minimal reports, and assuring families that their children would return on their own. This assumption was deadly. It gave Corll the time and freedom to continue killing, turning silence into cover. Olsen emphasizes this failure because it is central to the story. The crimes were not invisible, but the warnings were ignored. This indifference is as much a villain in the book as Corll himself. The victims' families carried the scars of that indifference for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of feeling not only grief but betrayal by the authorities who should have protected them, by the neighbors who looked away, by the systems that discounted their pleas. This layered pain is what made their persistence so remarkable. Even decades later they continued to speak, to oppose parole, to ensure their children's names were not lost. Their voices became the conscience of the narrative, reminding us that the cost of neglect is not abstract but human, borne by those left behind. Henley's continued presence in prison turned him into a kind of living echo of the crimes. Each time his parole hearing appeared on the calendar, the past resurfaced. Families prepared statements, journalists revisited the story, and the old wounds were reopened. Henley himself seemed at times weary, at other times defiant, his words a mixture of regret and self-defense. For some, his life sentence represented justice. For others, it represented the unresolved complexity of a boy who was both victim and perpetrator. That tension ensures that the story remains unsettled, a reminder that some crimes resist neat resolution. Brooks, by contrast, remained almost invisible in the public eye. His life sentence was lived in obscurity, without the recurring spotlight of parole hearings. Yet his role is no less significant. He was the first to be corrupted, the teenager whose compliance gave Corll his opening. His silence in later years denies us the opportunity to understand his perspective, but it also denies Corll the spectacle of accomplices defending themselves. Brooks' obscurity is its own kind of testimony, a life erased by early choices, a future consumed by complicity. The victims remain the core of the story. Their faces in photographs, their hobbies, their laughter described by families, these details give the book its heart. Olsen insists that readers know them, that they are remembered as more than a list of names. Their humanity is what elevates the book beyond crime reporting. It transforms it into a memorial, a record of lives stolen and families broken. By centering the boys, Olsen resists the erasure intended by Corll, ensuring that their presence endures even in absence. The cultural impact of the murders is visible in the reforms that followed. Missing children campaigns, public service announcements, and new police protocols all grew out of the recognition that predators thrive in neglect. The Candyman murders helped change a culture that once dismissed disappearances into one that responds with urgency. The cost of that transformation was unbearable, but the result has been lives saved in the decades since. In this way, the boys' deaths shaped the future, their absence turned into vigilance for others. Readers who approach the book today describe it as relentless. It does not let them escape into detachment. Each disappearance, each ignored warning, each grieving family pulls them deeper into sorrow and outrage. By the end, they are left with a sense of responsibility, a recognition that silence is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that empathy must be active. Olsen's restraint amplifies this effect. He avoids sensationalism, letting the facts speak for themselves, and the result is a narrative that lingers far beyond its final page. Ultimately, the Candyman murders endure not because of Corll, but because of the boys and the lessons their loss forces us to learn. They remind us that evil thrives in indifference, that communities must listen to those who cry for help, that predators exploit silence as much as trust. Olsen's book captures these truths with clarity and compassion, ensuring that the boys are remembered and that the warning is carried forward. It is both memorial and indictment, both history and conscience, both grief and warning. It endures because it has to, because the cost of forgetting would be measured in new tragedies. The Candyman murders are also a stark reminder of how history can be shaped not only by what happens, but by how it is remembered. Corll left behind no diaries, no trial testimony, no interviews. In a sense, he left behind nothing but destruction. The narrative that survives belongs to the victims, their families, the investigators, and the writer who chose to preserve their voices. Olsen's decision to keep the focus on those who suffered rather than the man who inflicted suffering ensures that memory itself resists corruption. In doing so, he denies Corll the twisted legacy of notoriety and instead builds a memorial out of prose. The ordinary facade of Corll remains one of the most unsettling elements. He was not a figure who stood out, not someone easily identified as a threat. He lived quietly, moved politely, and concealed his violence behind the mask of a neighbor. This ordinariness is what makes the story terrifying, because it reveals that predators can hide in plain sight, that danger is not always announced by obvious warning signs. Olsen presents this truth without sensationalism, allowing the reader to feel the disquiet that comes from recognizing how fragile trust can be. Brooks and Henley embody the long tail of manipulation. Both were adolescents drawn into Corll's orbit, corrupted into complicity, trapped by dependence and fear. Their lives after arrest show how deeply corruption destroys. Brooks vanished into obscurity, living a shadowed existence in prison. Henley became a public figure in spite of himself, his parole hearings ensuring that his face returned to headlines every few years. Together they demonstrate the ways predators extend their reach not only by harming directly, but by transforming others into accomplices. Their stories are cautionary tales about the cost of vulnerability exploited. The victims remain the heart of Olsen's book. Their faces in photographs, their parents' memories, their futures stolen. All of these details make the narrative more than a chronicle of crime. They make it a memorial. Each boy is presented as an individual, not as a statistic. The grief of their families, the absence in their communities, the milestones they never reached, these become the truest measure of Corll's cruelty. The book endures because it restores humanity where the killer sought to erase it. Henley's parole hearings have become almost ritual performances of unresolved pain. Families appear again and again to speak against his release, their voices steady but weighted with decades of sorrow. Supporters present him as a manipulated child who eventually turned against his abuser. Opponents insist that his betrayal of friends was too deep, his complicity too active. The board's repeated denials show society's reluctance to forgive, yet the cycle itself ensures that the past is never buried. Henley's presence in prison is a reminder that some wounds remain open as long as those who inflicted them are alive. The cultural changes sparked by the Candyman murders continue to ripple outward. The way missing children are treated today, the urgency of Amber Alerts, the seriousness with which disappearances are investigated, all of these carry within them the lessons of Houston. While tragedies elsewhere contributed, Corll's spree was a turning point that showed the danger of neglect. The reforms are part of the victim's legacy, a form of justice that reaches beyond their own generation to protect children who came after. Readers of The Man with the Candy often describe the experience as haunting because Olsen does not let them turn away. He presents the facts with clarity, gives voice to families, and refuses to sensationalize. The result is a narrative that lingers, that changes how readers see their communities, that challenges them to pay attention. The book is not an easy read, but it is a necessary one. It transforms grief into testimony and demands empathy from every page. Ultimately, the Candyman murders endure in memory not because of Corll, but because of the boys, the families who loved them, and the lessons their loss forces us to carry. They remind us that vigilance is essential, that silence is dangerous, that trust can be weaponized. Olsen's achievement is to preserve this warning in words that outlast decades, ensuring that the boys are remembered and that the cost of indifference is never forgotten. His book is both history and conscience, both mourning and warning. It endures because forgetting would be another betrayal. The Candyman murders occupy a space in history where memory, grief, and vigilance intersect. They are not only a record of what one man did, but also a record of what society failed to do. Olsen's book captures this duality with precision, showing how the murders were the product of cruelty but also of indifference. The silence of institutions, the the dismissal of parents' pleas, the reluctance of neighbors to question what they saw, all of these elements combined to create the conditions in which Corll thrived. This broader truth ensures that the story is not confined to the past, but speaks urgently to the present. The family's persistence across decades is perhaps the most inspiring element of the narrative. Though grief consumed them, they refused to let their sons be forgotten. They spoke at hearings, they gave interviews, they kept photographs alive. Their voices ensured that the boys remained present in public memory, that the story did not collapse into abstraction. Olsen's decision to amplify these voices makes his book not only a history of crime, but also a monument to love enduring beyond loss. It is in these voices that the humanity of the narrative is anchored. Henley's imprisonment and Brooks's obscurity together illustrate the long shadows cast by corruption. Their lives, shaped forever by adolescence under Corll's influence, remind us that predators destroy not only directly, but indirectly, consuming those they manipulate. Their presence in the narrative complicates it, forcing readers to reckon with the blurred lines of responsibility. Olsen presents them not as excuses but as realities, reminders of how far cruelty can spread. The broader cultural impact of the case remains visible in how America treats missing children today. No disappearance is dismissed casually, no plea from a parent ignored without consequence. Protocols, alerts, and databases reflect the lessons carved into history by tragedies like Houston's. These reforms are part of the victim's legacy, a form of justice that reaches into the future. Though imperfect, they represent progress built upon sorrow, vigilance born from grief. For readers, the book remains haunting precisely because it refuses to sensationalize. Olsen writes with restraint, empathy, and clarity, allowing the horror to emerge naturally. The effect is more lasting than any lurid detail could be. It lingers in memory, shaping how readers see their communities, their responsibilities, their institutions. The book endures because it insists that we carry its lessons forward. Ultimately, the Candyman murders remind us of the fragility of safety, the necessity of vigilance, and the power of remembrance. They compel us to listen when families cry out, to act when warnings are sounded, to refuse silence in the face of danger. Olsen's book ensures that these lessons are preserved, that the boys are remembered, that the tragedy is transformed into testimony. It is not merely a book about crime, it is a book about conscience, about memory, about justice. The Man with the Candy closes not with triumph, but with remembrance. It is not a story that ends neatly, because grief does not end, and the questions it raises resist final answers. The murders of Houston in the 1970s stand as one of the darkest chapters in American history, a case that revealed not only the cruelty of a single man, but the silence of an entire community. What Olsen achieved was not merely to recount events, but to preserve voices that might otherwise have been lost. In doing so, he created a book that functions as both history and memorial. The true weight of the story lies in the boys themselves. They were not nameless victims, but children with families, laughter, and dreams. Corll tried to erase them, to reduce them to objects, but Olsen restored them. He gave them presence in memory, ensuring that their humanity survived even when their lives were stolen. For their families, the book is a monument in words, proof that love endures, that remembrance can outlast cruelty. For readers, it is a call to empathy, a demand that the dead not be forgotten. The figures of Brooks and Henley illustrate the reach of corruption, the way predators spread destruction beyond their direct victims. Their lives, spent in prison, are testimonies to the long shadow of manipulation. Henley remains the controversial figure, both rescuer and betrayer, both victim and perpetrator, his parole hearings replaying the debates endlessly. Brooks, quieter, serves as the reminder that complicity often ends, not with notoriety but with obscurity. Both are part of the legacy, their fates warnings as much as punishments. The larger lesson is one of vigilance. The Candyman murders happen not only because of Corll's cruelty, but because of society's silence. Parents were ignored, neighbors looked away, institutions failed. The result was tragedy on a scale almost unimaginable. This lesson remains urgent today. It tells us that silence is deadly, that indifference is complicity, that safety depends on listening, acting, and remembering. Olsen's book makes these truths unavoidable, embedding them in the reader's conscience. For readers, finishing The Man with the Candy is not relief, but reflection. The story lingers, unsettling and demanding. It changes how we see our communities, our responsibilities, and ourselves. That is Olsen's achievement, to write a book that does not fade, but endures, that continues to haunt decades later, that insists on remembrance. It is a book that matters because it honors those who were lost and challenges us to protect those who remain. In the end, the Candyman murders are not only a chapter in Houston's past, but a warning written in sorrow. They tell us that evil can hide in plain sight, that predators exploit silence, that vigilance is the price of safety. They remind us that memory is justice, that empathy is responsibility, that forgetting is betrayal. Jack Olsen's book ensures that we do not forget, that we carry the lessons forward, that we remember the boys whose lives were stolen and whose absence still speaks.